Margaret Hayes pressed her sister's final letter against her chest so hard she could feel the paper creasing against her heartbeat. Her hands weren't shaking from the cold. They were shaking because the man standing 20 feet away on that platform, the man with the straight back and the worn hat and the quiet eyes, scanning every face coming off that train, was looking for Eleanor. And Eleanor was in the ground back in Cincinnati, 3 weeks dead, with dirt still fresh over her name. Margaret had made a promise to a dying woman. She had not promised to stay. She had not promised to pretend. She had promised to deliver the truth in person, face to face, so that Nathan Cole would not spend the rest of his life standing on a platform, waiting for a woman who was never going to come. She hadn't expected him to be so still. She hadn't expected the way he held himself, not proud exactly, but something close to it. Dignified, maybe. Like a man who had already survived things that should have broken him and had simply decided not to be broken. She hadn't expected it to hurt this much to walk toward him. But she straightened her spine, picked up her suitcase, and walked anyway. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something in your chest, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me, and I read every one. Now let's get back to Margaret, because what happens in the next few minutes on that platform is going to change both of their lives forever. Nathan Cole had been standing at the Hargrove Station platform for 40 minutes before the train arrived, and in those 40 minutes, he had revised his expectations exactly 11 times. I knew this because he had caught himself doing it, building Eleanor Whitmore up in his mind. Then reminding himself that real women were not built from letters, then building her up again anyway, because a man waiting for his future couldn't exactly stop himself from hoping. The ring in his left breast pocket had been there since morning. He'd checked it twice already, not because he worried it had gone anywhere, but because the checking was something to do with his hands. The platform was crowded for Hargrove. 3 other men from neighboring ranches had come in for supplies, and 2 of them had nodded at Nathan with that particular combination of respect and pity that men extended to someone doing something they privately thought was a little desperate. Sending east for a bride. Paying a marriage broker. Admitting in the most public possible way that you had not been able to find a woman willing to choose you on her own. Nathan had made his peace with that. Or he'd told himself he had. The truth was that at 34 years old, with a ranch that was slowly strangling itself into failure, and 3 consecutive hard winters behind him, he had run out of the kind of pride that kept a man from asking for help. He'd written to the broker in April. By May, he had Eleanor's first letter. By June, he had 12 letters, and something in his chest had started to loosen something that had been knotted tight since his father died, and left him the land and the debt and the silence all at once. Eleanor wrote beautifully. That was the first thing. Her sentences moved like water, unhurried and clear, and she described the East the way a person describes something they love, but are ready to leave. She said she wanted open sky. She said she wanted work that meant something. She said she wasn't afraid of hard living, only of empty living, and that a life of drawing room conversations and pressed gloves and careful smallness had never been what she'd imagined for herself. Nathan had read that line 4 times in a row. He'd felt something he hadn't felt in years, recognized. Like someone had put language to a feeling he'd carried so long he'd stopped noticing it. He'd written back carefully. He wasn't a poet. He knew his letters were plain, maybe even dry, but he tried to be honest in them about the ranch's condition, about the debt, about what he could offer and what he couldn't. He thought it was only right that she know exactly what she was coming to. He didn't dress it up. He didn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. And Eleanor, or whoever was writing back, kept writing. That thought arrived with a chill he pushed immediately aside. The train whistle cut through the afternoon heat, and Nathan straightened without meaning to. Around the platform stirred people craning toward the tracks, children pulling at sleeves. The general restless motion of a place that had been waiting and now had somewhere to put its attention. He watched the passengers come off. A family first mother with 2 children under 5 and a husband carrying more luggage than any one man should attempt. Then an older gentleman in a suit that marked him as someone from somewhere larger than Hargrove. Then a young man who looked like he'd been traveling for days and intended to sleep for just as many. Then the woman in the brown dress. She wasn't what he'd expected. He registered this before he had time to think about what he had expected. She was around his age, maybe a few years younger, and she was carrying a single suitcase that looked like it had made this kind of journey before, and not always gently. Her dress was worn but clean. Her hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who didn't have time or interest in elaborate arrangements. She was scanning the platform with an expression that Nathan couldn't immediately read, not searching exactly. More like a person walking towards something they have already decided to walk toward, regardless of what it costs. She found him before he could sort out whether she was Eleanor. He knew immediately that she wasn't. I didn't know how he knew. There was no logical reason he'd never met. Eleanor had no photograph, had only the letters. But something in the way this woman's face changed when she saw him, not lighting up with the relief of arrival, not softening with the nervousness of a first meeting, but tightening like a person preparing to deliver news. They have been rehearsing for a very long time, told him that whatever was happening next was not what he'd planned for. She walked straight to him. No hesitation. She stopped at a respectable distance, close enough to speak without raising her voice, and she looked at him directly. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She held a letter out to him with both hands. He noticed her knuckles were white. "My name is Margaret Hayes. Eleanor was my younger sister." She paused. Her voice was steady, but it cost her something to keep it that way. He could see that. "She passed away 3 weeks ago. She wanted me to bring you this in person. She didn't want you waiting for someone who wasn't coming." Nathan stared at her. He stared at the letter. He stared at her again. He had the peculiar sensation of a man watching the ground he was standing on shift without warning. Not a collapse, not a catastrophe, just a slow, quiet rearrangement that left everything in slightly the wrong place. "Eleanor is dead," he said. Not a question. He just needed to say it, hear it out loud, because the words in his own head weren't settling anywhere. "Yes, sir." Margaret's throat moved. "Fever. It came on fast. She was so sorry. She asked me to tell you that. She was so sorry she couldn't come herself, and she wanted me to make sure you knew that she meant every word she wrote you. Every single word." Nathan looked down at the letter in his hands. He hadn't taken it consciously. He'd just found it there. "I'm not the bride you paid for," Margaret said. "I know that. I'm not asking anything from you, Mr. Cole. I just needed to make sure you knew. I couldn't let you stand here not knowing." She picked up her suitcase. She was turning to leave. And Nathan Cole did something he would not have been able to explain if anyone had asked him. He said, "Where are you going?" Margaret stopped. She looked back at him with an expression that suggested the question surprised her. "I'll find the stage to Billings," she said. "And from there back east." "You came all the way from Cincinnati?" "Yes, sir." "To tell me that?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the platform was clearing, the crowd dispersing back into the ordinary business of a Tuesday afternoon in Hargrove, Montana. The family had loaded their bags. The man in the suit had found his ride. The young man who needed sleep had already gone. It was just the two of them, and the dust, and the sound of the train pulling out behind her. "When's the next stage to Billings?" Nathan asked. "I'm not certain. I was told tomorrow morning, maybe." "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" Margaret paused. The pause answered the question. Nathan picked up her suitcase before she could say anything. "My ranch is 3 miles out," he said. "You can have the spare room. Tomorrow I'll drive you to town myself for the stage." "Mr. Cole, that's not necessary." "Ma'am," he said, and something in his voice was quiet enough that she stopped. "You traveled 1,000 miles to keep a dead woman's promise. The least I can do is make sure you have a bed tonight." She didn't argue after that. They rode back to the ranch mostly in silence. Nathan drove. Margaret sat straight beside him on the wagon seat, her suitcase in the back, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at the land the way people from the East often looked at it, with a kind of careful adjustment, like their eyes were recalibrating for so much open space. "It's bigger than I expected," she said after a while. "The territory, all of it." Nathan nodded. He didn't have anything to add to that. He knew what she meant without needing it explained. He was still holding the letter in his breast pocket unopened. He hadn't been able to make himself open it on the platform, and he wasn't going to open it in front of her. It felt private in a way he couldn't articulate, like something that needed to be done alone in quiet, when he could let whatever came out of it land without an audience. The ranch looked smaller when they arrived than it did in Nathan's mind. He'd noticed that before, how a place shrank in proportion to how much you needed it to be something it wasn't. The house was sound, but it needed paint. The fence along the east pasture had a section that had been meaning to be fixed since spring. The garden plot beside the house was just dirt undisturbed, because he'd thought about planting something there 2 years running and never gotten to it. "This is it," he said, and he heard the flatness in his own voice. "It's good land," Margaret said. He glanced at her. She was looking at the pasture with that same focused expression she'd had on the platform, the one he was starting to recognize as simply the way she looked when she was actually thinking about something. "You can tell that?" he asked. "The grass is still green this late in summer. The soil holds water." She glanced at the garden plot. "You haven't planted anything?" "No." "Why not?" He thought about several answers and settled on the honest one. "Never seemed worth it just for me." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not pity. He would have closed himself off from pity immediately. Something quieter. Something that looked more like understanding. She didn't say anything to that. She picked up her suitcase and followed him inside. The spare room was plain. A bed, a chest, a window that faced east. Margaret stood in the door and looked at it with the expression of a woman who had slept in worse places and was not going to say so. "It's fine," she said. "Thank you." Nathan left her to settle in and went out to do the evening chores. He fed the horses, checked the cattle in the near pasture, repaired a latch on the barn door that had been loose for a week. He worked steadily and without urgency, the way he did everything. And somewhere in the middle of it, he realized his hands had stopped their low-level trembling from earlier in the afternoon. He ate supper alone as he always did. Or he started to. Margaret came out of the spare room 20 minutes after he'd sat down carrying the pot she'd found on the stove that he'd left sitting with the intention of possibly doing something with it eventually, and she set it back on the heat without asking and added 3 things from the supplies in the pantry. And inside of 12 minutes, the kitchen smelled like something a person might actually want to eat. She set a bowl in front of him without comment and sat down across the table with her own. Nathan looked at the bowl. He looked at her. "I didn't ask you to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "You didn't." He picked up the spoon. It was the best thing he'd eaten in longer than he wanted to admit, and he was not going to say that either. So he ate in silence, and Margaret ate in silence, and it wasn't an uncomfortable silence the way silences between strangers usually were. It was something else. Something he didn't have a word for. After supper, she washed the dishes. He dried them. She handed, he stacked, and neither of them remarked on the fact that they had somehow fallen into a rhythm without discussing it. "You're not what I expected," Nathan said finally. Margaret handed him a bowl. "What did you expect?" "Eleanor's letters described someone." He stopped. That felt unkind. He started again. "She described herself a particular way." "I know how she described herself," Margaret said. There was something careful in her voice. She had a gift for painting pictures with words. She always did. "You sound like you're choosing what to say." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She handed him the last dish and dried her hands on the cloth hanging from the oven rail. "Eleanor was a wonderful woman," she said. "She was kind, and she was warm, and she was everything she told you she was. I'm not saying otherwise." She folded the cloth neatly. She had a way of describing things the way she hoped they would be, rather than always the way they were. It wasn't dishonest. It was just Eleanor. She believed in the future more than the present. Nathan set the last dish on the shelf. "And you?" I tend to concern myself with what's in front of me." He believed that immediately. He'd believed it from the moment she stepped off the train with that letter in both hands and told him the truth before he even had time to brace for it. "That must have been hard," he said, "coming all this way. It needed doing. You could have sent a letter." Margaret looked at him. Her eyes were steady and brown, and said things her voice wasn't saying. She asked me to come in person. She said she didn't want you to be alone when you found out. She paused. She cared about you, Mr. Cole. Even without ever having met you. The letters meant something to her. You meant something to her. Nathan looked away. He looked at the window, at the dark outside it, at nothing in particular. I was going to meet her tomorrow, he said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. I'd planned a whole... He stopped. He was not a man who talked about himself this way, and he was annoyed at himself for starting. It doesn't matter. It matters, Margaret said quietly. No, Mr. Cole. Her voice was gentle, but it didn't bend. You were waiting for someone. You had the right to hope. You don't have to pretend that didn't mean something just because it hurts. He looked at her. She looked back at him. And Nathan Cole, who had not let anyone see anything inconvenient in him for a very long time, had the strange and deeply uncomfortable experience of feeling like someone was actually looking at him. Not at what he could offer, not at what he represented, not at the ranch or the land or the prospect. At him. He cleared his throat. I'll have you to town by 8, he said. Stage leaves at 9. Thank you. He went to bed. He didn't sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch at night, which he knew as well as he knew his own breathing, and which had never felt particularly lonely until now, when there was someone else in the spare room down the hall, and the whole house felt oddly, almost painfully less empty. He opened Eleanor's letter somewhere around midnight. He read it by lamplight, and he read it twice. It was a beautiful letter. It was warm and generous, and full of the same quality Margaret had described Eleanor writing toward a future she'd imagined, rather than a present she'd lived. She apologized. She asked him to forgive her for not being able to come. She asked him to be patient with whoever eventually came into his life, because she believed he deserved the kind of love that changed a person, not just the kind that completed a transaction. And near the end, in handwriting that was slightly different from the main body of the letter, slightly less graceful, slightly more urgent, she had written something that made Nathan go still. Maggie has been writing some of these letters. Not all of them, but some. She didn't tell you because I asked her not to. Please don't be angry at her. She was only helping me, and she is the best person I have ever known. If you want to understand what kind of woman could travel 1,000 miles alone just to keep a promise, you only need to look at what she's already done. Whatever you think of me, please be kind to her. She deserves kindness more than almost anyone I've ever met. Nathan set the letter down on his chest and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the letters. He thought about which parts had felt most like Eleanor, and which parts had felt different, more practical, more direct, more interested in the specifics of ranching and weather and survival than in descriptions of drawing rooms and imagined futures. He thought about Margaret in the kitchen, adding 3 things from the pantry without asking. He thought about her handing him dishes and not commenting on the fact that they'd fallen into a rhythm. He thought about never seemed worth it just for me, and the way she'd looked at him after. He did not sleep until very close to dawn. And when he finally did, his dreams were not about Eleanor. In the morning, he found Margaret already up, coffee made, and a list sitting on the kitchen table. He looked at the list. It was organized by category and level of urgency. The east fence, the garden plot, the supply inventory, the cattle numbers versus the hay stores, and whether one or the other needed adjustment before winter. I walked the property at first light, she said from across the kitchen, pouring coffee without looking at him. I hope that's all right. I couldn't sleep. You walked my property at first light. I didn't go through your papers or anything private. She finally looked at him. I noticed some things yesterday, and I needed to see if I was right about them. And were you? Some yes, some no. She nodded at the list. The east fence is worse than it looks from the road, but the soil out past the barn is better than you're using it for. And you're losing money on the cattle-to-feed ratio because you've got too many animals for the hay you're able to produce, but you could fix that without selling off the herd if you rotated the grazing differently. Nathan picked up the list. He read it carefully. It was specific. It was accurate. It was the kind of assessment that would have taken most people 2 weeks to produce, and her apparently one morning. "You know ranching," he said. "I know farming. Some of it crosses over." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "My father had 40 acres in Ohio. Not cattle, mostly crops, but the principles aren't entirely different. You managed it. He was sick the last 4 years of his life. Someone had to." Nathan set the list down. He looked at her across the kitchen in the early morning light, and he thought about a woman who had managed 40 acres while her father was dying. And then when her sister was dying, had packed a suitcase and traveled 1,000 miles to keep a promise. And he felt something shift in him again, that same quiet rearrangement from the platform, but deeper this time. "I was going to drive you to town at 8, he said. "I know." "The stage leaves at 9. "I know." He picked up his coffee. "You don't have to leave today," he said carefully. "If you didn't want to." Margaret looked at him. Her expression was complicated in a way he couldn't entirely read. "Mr. Cole, the east fence isn't going to fix itself," he said. "And I don't know how to rotate the grazing. I've been doing it the same way since my father showed me when I was 12. And if what you're saying is right, I've been doing it wrong for 20 years. A silence. She looked down at her coffee. "I could stay a few days," she said finally. "Just to help with just practically, while I arrange the stage." "That seems reasonable," Nathan said. She nodded. He nodded. Neither of them mentioned that the stage to Billings ran 3 times a week, and the next one after tomorrow's wasn't until Friday, which meant that if she missed tomorrow's, she would be here until the end of the week at least. Nathan Cole finished his coffee, picked up his hat from the hook by the door, and went out to start the morning chores. And Margaret Hayes, who had arrived with a suitcase and a dying woman's letter, and absolutely no intention of staying, stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and did not pick up her suitcase and walk down the road toward town. She picked up the list. She went to find the tools. Outside in the east pasture, the fence waited. The soil waited. The empty garden plots, in the morning sun, with all its possibility, untouched, exactly as it had been for 2 years. Patient, in the way that good land was patient, not giving up, just waiting for someone to finally decide it was worth it. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathan Cole fixed the latch on the barn door and felt something that was not entirely different from hope. 3 days later, Margaret was still there. She had not technically made a decision. She had simply not yet made the decision to leave, which was a distinction she maintained carefully in her own mind, because the alternative admitting that she was staying because she wanted to raise complications she was not yet ready to look at directly. She slept in the spare room. She kept her suitcase packed. She told herself every morning that she was going to talk to Nathan about the stage, and every morning something came up. A problem with the water trough. A question about the supply inventory. A discussion about the grazing rotation that ran longer than expected, because Nathan had more questions than he let on initially, and the questions were good ones, the kind that came from a man who had been thinking about his problems seriously and just needed someone to think out loud with. That was not what she'd expected either. She had carried a picture of him in her mind since Eleanor first started writing, constructed from the gaps between her sister's descriptions, from the things Eleanor talked about, and the things she didn't, from the letters Margaret had read, and she had to admit to herself from the letters she had contributed. She'd imagined someone stiff maybe. Formal. Practical to the point of coldness, the kind of man who sent for a bride through a broker, because human connection was more efficient when organized in advance. Nathan Cole was practical, yes. He was economical with words in a way she'd come to realize was not coldness, but precision. He didn't say things he didn't mean, which meant that when he did say things, they landed differently than words usually did. He was also underneath that precision quietly funny. She discovered this on the second day when she was wrestling with a particularly stubborn section of fence post, and he walked over, watched her for a moment, and said completely deadpan, "I could help, but you seem to have it." She had not expected to laugh. She had not expected to laugh like that genuinely, without thinking about it, the kind of laugh that surprises you from the inside. Nathan had looked almost startled. Then something in his face had shifted in a way she couldn't name and didn't let herself look at for long. By the fourth day, she had reorganized the supply pantry, sketched a rough plan for the garden plot, and identified 3 places in the cattle rotation system where minor adjustments would reduce waste significantly. She presented these to Nathan over supper as practical observations, not suggestions, because she was acutely aware of the line between helping and overstepping, and she did not want him to think she was trying to make herself indispensable. He looked at her plans for a long time. "You did all this today," he said. "I had time this afternoon. The fence was done by noon." "Margaret." He looked up. He'd started using her given name on the 3rd day without discussion. She'd noticed, but hadn't said anything. "This would have taken me a month to work out." I had a fresh eye. Sometimes that matters more than experience. He looked at the plans again. "I want to show you something," he said. I took her out to the far south field after supper in the long western light that made everything in Montana look like it was lit from inside. He showed her the spring that ran along the edge of the property, seasonal but reliable, and positioned well enough that with some simple work, water could be redirected toward the unused garden area. "I've known about this for years," he said. "Never figured out how to use it." Margaret looked at the spring. She looked at the angle of the slope. She looked at the distance back to the garden plot and did some mental arithmetic. "Gravity feed," she said. "You wouldn't even need a pump. If you laid pipe at about a 3% grade, I'd have to trench it." "Yes. That's a week of work. Maybe 2 if you're doing it alone." She looked at him. "You wouldn't be doing it alone." The words came out before she'd finished thinking them through, and she heard them land in the quiet between them and felt the weight of what they implied. Nathan was looking at her with that expression she still couldn't entirely read, careful, attentive, like a man listening for something underneath what was being said. "You're talking about staying," he said. "I'm talking about a practical project that would significantly improve the ranch's water situation," she said. "Margaret." She looked away at the spring, at the water running clear and unhurried over the stones at its edge. "I don't know what I'm talking about," she said honestly. "I came here to deliver a letter and then leave. That was the plan. That was the only plan." "Plans change," Nathan said. Not like this. Not—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together and tried to organize herself. "Mr. Cole." "Nathan." "Nathan." The name felt different said out loud than it had in the letters. More real, more present, more frightening. "I am Eleanor's sister. I came because she asked me to. If this became something other than what it started as, I would never know if I stayed for the right reasons, or if I stayed because I felt because she..." She couldn't finish that sentence. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I read the whole letter," he said. She went very still. "The one you brought me," he said. "I read what she wrote at the end." Margaret turned to look at him. "She told me some of the letters were yours," he said. Not as an accusation, just as a fact offered gently. "Nathan." "I've been trying to remember," he said slowly. "Which ones felt different? More practical? More, I don't know. More like someone who'd actually worked land before rather than imagined it." He paused. "There were 7 or 8, maybe more." Margaret felt heat in her face. She felt it in her chest and her throat and behind her eyes in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I was only helping her," she said. "She asked me to. She was so ill by the end and she didn't want to stop writing because she said the letters were the thing keeping her. They were the thing that felt like the future. She wanted to keep the future going as long as she could." She pressed her hand against her sternum briefly. "I never meant to deceive you. I thought the letters would stop when she was gone. I didn't think you'd ever—" "I'm not angry," Nathan said. She stopped. He said it again quietly. "I'm not angry. You should be. Maybe." He looked at the spring. "But I read those letters again last night, the ones I think were yours, and there was something in them." He paused like he was choosing very carefully. "It was like talking to someone real, not a hope, not a plan. Someone real who was thinking hard about the same things I was thinking hard about." Margaret could not speak. "I came to that platform to meet Eleanor," he said, "and I was ready to grieve her when you told me. I am grieving her. I don't want you to think I'm not." He looked at her. But I've been honest with myself the last 4 nights, lying awake, not sleeping, and I think I need to be honest with you too. I don't think I was in love with Eleanor. I think I was in love with the idea of not being alone." He paused. "And then you showed up, Nathan, and you organized my pantry, and fixed my fence, and walked my property at 5 in the morning, and made a water management plan over supper," he said. "And I have not wanted you to leave for 3 days, and I'm a plain-speaking man, Margaret. I can't pretend otherwise." The silence that followed was the loudest silence Margaret Hayes had ever stood inside. "I don't know what I feel," she said finally. It was the truest thing she could offer him. "That's honest," he said. "I only know that when I think about leaving—" She stopped. She started again. "The stage was yesterday. I told myself I would take it. I did not take it. I know. I don't know what that means." "It might not need to mean anything yet," he said. "You could just stay, see?" She looked at him in the long light. This plain-speaking, quietly funny, careful man, with the straight back and the worn hat, and the eyes that listened as hard as they looked. This man who had not asked her for anything, who had given her the spare room and the coffee and the space to move through his property with a pencil and a notebook, and had never once in 4 days made her feel like she owed him something for it. "I would need to write home," she said finally. "My neighbor is watching the house. There's a postal drop in town. And I would need—" She was still thinking out loud. She knew it. She was doing that thing where she talked herself through a decision while someone else was watching, and she couldn't seem to stop. "I would need it to be understood that I'm not, that this is not—" "It's you staying to help with a ranch," he said. "That's all it is." She looked at him. Something in his expression was careful and kind, and absolutely did not believe that, and she did not believe it either. But it was something they could both hold on to while the rest of it sorted itself out. "All right," Margaret Hayes said. And Nathan Cole put his hat back on his head, and they walked back to the ranch house in the long gold light of a Montana evening, and neither of them said another word, and that was somehow exactly right. The east pasture fence was finished by the end of the week. The garden plot had been turned and was ready for seed. And the spring, running clear over its stones at the edge of the south field, waited patiently for the pipe that would carry its water exactly where it needed to go. The pipe arrived on a Thursday. Nathan had ordered it from the hardware merchant in Billings 3 days after Margaret drew her water management sketch on the back of a supply list, and when it came off the freight wagon, 12 feet of iron pipe wrapped in burlap. The merchant's boy gave Nathan a look that said he'd heard about the woman staying at the Cole Ranch and had opinions about it. Nathan paid the invoice and didn't offer the boy anything to add to his opinions. Margaret was already in the south field when Nathan drove the wagon back. She'd brought a measuring stick she'd made herself from a straight branch and careful notches, and a notebook she'd been filling with calculations since early morning. She looked up when she heard the wagon, and something in her face changed, not quite a smile, but the thing that came right before one. "It came," she said. "Told you it would. You said maybe Friday." Merchant moved fast. Nathan climbed down from the wagon and looked at the field. She'd already marked the trench line with small stones, a neat curve from the spring down toward the garden following the grade she'd calculated. "You've been out here all morning. The angle matters. If I get it wrong by even half a degree, you won't get it wrong." She looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I've watched you work for a week, and you don't get things wrong." A pause. "Flattery won't make the pipe shorter," she said, and turned back to her notebook. Nathan found himself looking at the back of her head. The practical knot. Her hair was tied into the set of her shoulders, the way she crouched down to recheck one of her stone markers, with the focused attention of someone who cared deeply about getting things right. He turned away before she could catch him looking. They started digging the trench that afternoon. It was harder work than either of them had made it sound in the planning stage. The soil in the south field was good, deep, and dark, but that meant resistance, the earth not giving itself up easily, the way good things rarely did. Nathan dug and Margaret moved the displaced soil away from the trench edge, and somewhere in the third hour, without discussing it, they switched and she dug while he moved, and neither of them commented on the exchange. By sundown they had 6 feet of trench. They needed 40. That's going to take a while, Nathan said, surveying their progress. 6 days, Margaret said. She was wiping her hands on a cloth, calculating already. Maybe 5 if the soil is easier further along. You've already figured that out. I've been figuring things while I dig. It keeps me from thinking about how much my back hurts. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it. Your back hurts too, she said. I've had worse. That's not a denial. This time he did smile briefly, and she looked away first. They ate supper that evening with the quiet ease that had settled over the kitchen table in the past week. The kind of easy silence that only existed between people who had stopped being strangers without quite deciding to. Margaret had cooked again. She cooked most evenings, not because Nathan expected it, but because she was faster at it, and they both knew it, and efficiency had become the language they used when they wanted to do something for each other without calling it by its right name. Tell me about Ohio, Nathan said while she refilled the water glasses. She looked up mildly surprised. In a week he hadn't asked her a personal question that wasn't directly related to the ranch or the work. What do you want to know? Whatever you want to say. She sat down. She turned the water glass in her hands. My father's farm was 42 acres, she said. Mostly corn, some wheat, a kitchen garden. He had it for 30 years. He knew every foot of it. She paused. When he got sick, I was 22. Eleanor was 18. She was not suited to farming. Something quiet moved across her face. She had my mother's gift for making things beautiful, and my mother's way of believing that beauty was a form of work, which it is, I suppose, only it doesn't bring the harvest in. So you brought the harvest in. I brought the harvest in. She said it simply without bitterness, but he heard everything underneath it. 4 years of harvest. 4 years of carrying something that was supposed to be shared. Eleanor helped where she could. She kept father's spirits up better than anyone. She had a gift for that too, for making a person feel like the world was larger than their trouble. She stopped. I miss that about her. I miss it more than I expected to. Nathan was quiet for a moment. She sounds like she was easy to love, he said. She was. Margaret looked down at the table. Everyone loved Eleanor. It was effortless for her the way some things are effortless for some people, like breathing. She paused. It was never effortless for me. Being loved. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away again. Connecting. I always had to work for it. Eleanor could walk into a room and have 3 friends in 5 minutes. I'd walk into the same room and find the corner with the best light and read a book. Nathan looked at her across the table. This woman who had walked across 1,000 miles to keep a dying woman's promise, who woke before sunrise and fixed fences and made water plans and cooked supper and hadn't in an entire week once asked him for anything. Reading in corners has its uses, he said. She glanced at him. Is that meant to make me feel better? It's meant to be honest. I've known plenty of people who fill rooms. Most of them don't have anything much to say. A beat of silence. You're decent at this, she said. At what? At saying the right thing, without making it sound like you're trying to. I'm not trying to, he said. I'm just saying what's true. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she'd been allowing herself to lately. And then she stood up and took her bowl to the wash basin, and Nathan let her have the retreat, because he understood it. The instinct to step back when something started feeling too real, too close, too much like a door you hadn't decided yet whether to walk through. He understood it because he was doing it too. The trench reached 12 feet by the end of the following day, and that was the day Ruth Calloway arrived. Ruth was the wife of Thomas Calloway, who ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, and had made it his business since Nathan's father died to offer annually to buy the coal land at a price that was technically fair and spiritually insulting. Nathan had refused 4 times. He intended to refuse a 5th. But it was Ruth who came visiting, not Thomas, and Ruth came under the flag of neighborly concern, which was a flag Nathan had learned to be suspicious of. She arrived by buggy in the late morning when Nathan was in the barn, and Margaret was in the garden, measuring beds. Ruth was a woman of perhaps 50, well-dressed by county standards, with the manner of someone accustomed to being the most important woman in any given room. She found Margaret first. Nathan came out of the barn to the sound of voices. Margaret's low and measured, Ruth's carrying the particular brightness of a woman making an assessment while pretending to make conversation. "You must be the seamstress," Ruth was saying when Nathan came close enough to hear. "From Cincinnati." "Margaret Hayes," Margaret said. "And yes. Nathan's been keeping you busy, I see." Ruth's eyes moved over the measured garden beds, over Margaret's work-worn hands, with the swift calculation of a woman who catalogued everything she saw. "We heard you'd come to. Well, the story varies depending on who's telling it." "The story is simple enough," Margaret said. "I came to deliver news. I've stayed on to help with the ranch for a time." "Help with the ranch?" Ruth repeated it with a smile that had no warmth in it. "How practical. And how long are you planning to stay?" "As long as I'm useful." "I see." Ruth turned to Nathan, who had arrived at the garden fence. "Nathan, I've been meaning to come by. Thomas wanted me to check in. We've been hearing some talk about the east fence being in bad shape and we were concerned." "East fence is repaired," Nathan said. Ruth's smile tightened very slightly. "And the water situation Thomas mentioned, you've been having trouble with summer irrigation." "Working on it," Nathan said. "Yes, I can see that." Ruth looked at the trench in the south field, at the iron pipe waiting nearby, with an expression that suggested she was adding figures in her head. "That must have cost you something. The pipe alone." "The ranch's finances aren't a matter for conversation, Ruth." "Of course not." Ruth looked at Margaret. "We should have you to dinner sometime. Get to know you properly since you're here." The invitation was the social equivalent of a pin pressed into something soft. "The ladies in town have been wondering about you." "That's kind," Margaret said with perfect pleasantness. "I'm afraid I've been rather occupied." Ruth looked between them at Nathan's flat expression, at Margaret's polite one, and did the calculation one more time and came to whatever conclusion she'd come for. "Well," she said brightly, "I won't keep you from your work. Nathan, do tell Thomas if you need anything. He's always been glad to help a neighbor." She left. The silence she left behind had texture to it. "She came to look at me," Margaret said. "Yes, and to check whether your fence is actually repaired or whether you're falling apart enough that Thomas can buy you out at last." Nathan looked at her. "You got all that from a 10-minute visit." "I grew up with 40 acres and a sick father," Margaret said. "I learned to recognize people who are deciding whether you're vulnerable." She picked up her measuring rope. "Is Thomas Calloway the kind of man who waits for vulnerability?" "He's patient," Nathan said. "I'll give him that. How much debt do you carry?" The question landed flat and direct, the way Margaret's questions always did, without apology for their frankness. Nathan looked at the south field for a moment. This was the thing he hadn't talked about. This was the thing that lived underneath everything else, the root problem beneath all the fence problems and water problems and grazing problems. "Enough," he said. "Nathan, enough that a bad winter would finish me." He said it out loud for the first time to another person and felt the strange relief of it, the way that naming something reduced it slightly from a monster to a fact. "My father took a loan to expand the herd in '78. The winter of '79 took half the cattle. He never recovered what he'd borrowed. I've been carrying the balance since he died." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "How long do you have?" "The bank's been patient. Emmett Driscoll, he's the loan manager. He liked my father. But Driscoll retires this winter, and whoever comes after him won't have any reason to be patient." "What's the balance?" he told her. She didn't react the way most people would have, no sharp intake of breath, no visible calculation of his worthlessness. She just nodded, slow and thoughtful, the way she nodded when she was already working the problem. "The garden revenue won't cover it," she said. "Not alone. No. But it reduces the shortfall, and the grazing rotation reduces feed cost, and the water system reduces summer loss." She was doing it again, talking through it like a series of solvable problems rather than a single insurmountable wall. "What's your relationship with the merchants in town? Do you sell directly or through a middle buyer?" "Middle buyer." "You're losing margin." "I know. Have you tried selling direct to the hotel?" He paused. "The hotel. The Hargrove Grand has a kitchen that feeds 40 people a day. They buy their produce from a buyer in Billings and pay shipping costs on top. If you could guarantee supply, they'd pay you more than the buyer does and still save money themselves. She looked at him. Did that not occur to you? No, he said honestly. Well, she picked up her notebook. It occurred to me. He stared at her. She made a note without looking up. Margaret, he said. I need to ask you something. She looked up. Why are you doing this? His voice was careful, not suspicious. He'd moved past suspicious somewhere around day 3, but genuinely wanting to understand. You don't owe me anything. You came to deliver a letter. You've been here 12 days. You've fixed my fence, planned my garden, designed my water system, and you've just told me how to renegotiate my supply chain. He paused. Why? She held the notebook in both hands and looked at him with that expression, the complicated one. He could never entirely read the one that seemed to contain several things at once. Because it's fixable, she said. All of it. And it bothers me when fixable things don't get fixed. She paused. And because... She stopped. Because... Another pause, longer this time. She looked down at the notebook. Because you don't act like you deserve fixing, she said quietly. Like you've decided the ranch failing would just be what you deserve. And that bothers me more than the fence or the water or the buyer margin. The silence after that was so complete that Nathan could hear the spring running at the far edge of the field. I haven't decided that, he said. Nathan. He looked away. You told me it never seemed worth planting the garden, she said. Just for you. He didn't answer. That's not a man who thinks he deserves fixing, she said. That's a man who's been alone too long and started believing his own silence. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, you're not wrong. I know I'm not. She said it without arrogance, just plainly the way she said everything. But knowing I'm not wrong doesn't mean I know what to do about it. She turned back to her measuring rope. Come on, we're not going to finish the trench standing here talking. They went back to the trench. They dug until the light was gone. 3 days later, Nathan drove into Hargrove alone to speak with Gerald Pierce at the Hargrove Grand. Gerald Pierce was a practical man who'd been paying Billings prices for produce shipped 3 days old, and within 20 minutes of Nathan laying out what the garden could supply, Pierce had offered him a price per pound that was 40% above what Nathan was getting through the buyer. Nathan sat in his wagon outside the hotel for 5 minutes afterward, doing math on the back of an invoice slip. Then he drove back to the ranch faster than he'd driven anywhere in a long time. Margaret was in the barn when he arrived, checking on one of the horses who'd been favoring a leg. She came out at the sound of the wagon, shading her eyes. How did it go? He held up the invoice slip with the figures on the back. She took it. She looked at the numbers. He watched her face. Nathan, she said. Yeah. This is... She did the mental calculation. He could see her doing it. This covers a third of the winter feed cost before we've even planted. With a full summer garden, it does better than that. She looked at the numbers again. Then she looked at him. And her face, the face that was always composed, always practical, always the face of a woman who had been managing difficult realities since she was 22 years old, did something he had not seen it do before. It came undone slightly, just at the edges, just enough. You drove in there today, she said. By yourself. You told me to. I suggested it. Same thing. No, it isn't, and you know it. She looked down at the invoice slip. Last week you told me you'd tried to talk to Pierce 2 years ago and he sent you away. He did. What changed? Nathan took his hat off. He turned it in his hands, an old habit when he was saying something he meant. I had numbers, he said. Real numbers. Supply projections, seasonal breakdown, delivery schedule. He paused. Your numbers. She looked at him. I walked in there with a real plan, he said, and Pierce is a businessman. Businessmen respect plans. You could have made that plan yourself. Margaret. His voice was quiet. I did not make that plan myself. You made it, and you handed it to me, and it worked. He held her gaze. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She folded the invoice slip very precisely along its center. We should plant the first beds this week, she said, if we want supply ready by early fall. I know. The tomatoes go in first, longest season. I know. And we need to finish the trench before Margaret. She stopped. He stepped closer. Not dramatically, just the ordinary step of a man reducing the distance between himself and something important. Thank you, he said, just that. She held the folded invoice slip very carefully. You're welcome, she said. Her voice was slightly not her usual voice. The moment stretched one beat too long for either of them to call it ordinary, and then Nathan put his hat back on and walked to the barn, and Margaret looked at the invoice slip one more time and then put it in her apron pocket and went back inside. That night after supper, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to her neighbor in Cincinnati. She wrote that she had decided to extend her stay in Montana. She wrote that she was helping manage a ranch in a consulting capacity, which was not exactly a lie, only a careful arrangement of facts. She wrote that she was well and that the land was beautiful and that she was not certain when she would return. She sealed the letter and set it by the door for the morning post. Then she sat for a long time looking at the table. She was in love with him. She had known this for several days in the way that you could know something and simultaneously refuse to place it anywhere useful. She had catalogued it as a problem, set it to the side, continued working. She was good at that. She was, in fact, extraordinarily good at that. She had organized a dying man's farm and a dying woman's affairs and a failing man's ranch, and she was very skilled at turning things that hurt into things that needed doing. But sitting at the table in the quiet kitchen, with the letter to Cincinnati, sealed and ready, she ran out of things that needed doing for the evening, and the feeling had nowhere to be catalogued, and she sat with it. She thought about Eleanor. She thought about what Eleanor had written at the end of her letters about Nathan. She thought about what Eleanor had said in those final days. He sounds like a man who is lonely all the way down, Maggie. The kind of lonely that's been there so long he's stopped feeling it like pain. He just thinks it's how things are. Eleanor had said this with the particular insight of a woman who loved people effortlessly and could therefore see the shape of love's absence with perfect clarity. You'd be good for him, Eleanor had said. You'd be good for each other. You're both too stubborn to believe you deserve something real. Margaret had told her sister not to be ridiculous. She thought about that now, and her chest ached with something that had Eleanor's name on it, and something else underneath it that she was not ready to name. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. In the morning she was up before Nathan, as she always was, and she had the coffee made and was reading back through her garden projections when he came into the kitchen and stopped. "You look tired," he said. "Good morning to you too. Did you sleep?" "Some." She didn't look up from the projections. He poured his coffee. He leaned against the counter instead of sitting at the table, which was unusual. She noticed the deviation without looking at him. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the South Trench. About you." She looked up. He looked steady, the way he always looked, like a man who had already finished the argument with himself and was simply now reporting the outcome. "I think you should stay through harvest," he said. "Paid. A proper arrangement. Not charity, not obligation. A fair wage for a manager's work, because that's what you've been doing." He paused. "The hotel contract changes things financially. I can do it properly now." She studied him. "You worked this out this morning." "I worked it out 2 days ago. I've been trying to decide whether you'd be offended." "Why would I be offended?" "Because it might sound like I'm trying to—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Some people wouldn't want a business arrangement confused with—" He stopped again. They looked at each other. "That's a very careful sentence," Margaret said. "I'm a careful man. I know you are." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "You're asking me to stay through harvest as a paid manager?" "Yes." "That's a practical question with a practical answer." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Through harvest, a fair wage, a business arrangement." "Right. Right." Neither of them believed for a single moment that it was going to stay only that. They both knew it. The knowledge sat between them on the kitchen table, as visible as the coffee cups and the garden projections, and both of them looked at it, and neither of them said a word about it. That afternoon, they laid the first 6 feet of pipe in the trench. It fit exactly as Margaret's calculations had said it would. The water redirected ran exactly where she said it would run. Nathan stood at the garden end of the new pipe and watched water arrive where there had been only dry ground, and he felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope this time. Something closer to certainty. Something that felt quietly and without fanfare, like the beginning of a life worth building. He didn't look at Margaret, but she was standing 3 feet behind him, and he heard her quiet exhale, the small, involuntary sound of a person who has been right about something and feels, despite themselves, the deep satisfaction of it. "Good," she said softly. "Yeah," he said. They stood there for a moment, both of them watching the water run. Then, Ruth Calloway's buggy appeared at the edge of the south field, and Thomas Calloway was in it this time, and the look on his face as he surveyed the pipe and the trench and the newly measured garden beds was not the look of a man bringing neighborly good wishes. It was the look of a man recalculating. Nathan turned to face him. Margaret stood just slightly behind Nathan's right shoulder, her notebook under her arm and her chin level, and she did not move. Thomas Calloway climbed down from the buggy and walked toward them across the field, with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who wanted you to know he wasn't in a hurry, because men who weren't in a hurry held the power. "Nathan," he said, "quite the project you've got going." "Thomas." That pipe from Billings. Calloway looked at the trench with the expert eye of a man who understood exactly what it represented. "Spring feed, is it redirecting to the garden plot?" "That's right." Calloway clasped his hands behind his back. "Heard you paid a visit to Gerald Pierce." "Word travels. In a valley this size it does." Calloway smiled, which on his face was a tool rather than an expression. "I also heard Pierce offered you a supply contract." "Pierce and I came to an arrangement, yes." "Good for you." Calloway's eyes moved to Margaret. "Miss Hayes." "Mr. Calloway," Margaret said. "Settling in, I see." "Helping where I can," she said. Calloway looked at the pipe. He looked at the trench. He looked at the measured garden beds. He was adding it all up: the repaired fence, the water system, the hotel contract. And what he was arriving at was a version of events where Nathan Cole's ranch stopped being the soft target he'd been patient about for 4 years. "I'll be direct," Calloway said. "My offer for the land stands, given your debt situation." "My debt situation," Nathan said, "is my business. Of course. But if you're looking at a winter with that note coming due and no new loan manager at the bank willing to extend it." "My note isn't due until March." "Things move fast in banking these days." Nathan looked at him levelly. "Is that a fact?" Something flickered in Calloway's eyes, not quite a threat, but the shape of one. "I'm only saying the offer stands, whatever." His gaze moved briefly to Margaret. "Complications arise between now and then." "Thomas." Nathan's voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that had weight to it. "I think it's time you drove back the way you came." Calloway looked at him for a moment, looked at Margaret, recalculated. "Think about it," he said pleasantly, and walked back to his buggy. Nathan watched him go without moving. Margaret waited until the buggy was out of earshot. "He said that to rattle you," she said. "I know. About the loan manager. He may have more information about Driscoll's replacement than he's letting on." Nathan turned to look at her. "I know. We should find out who's coming," she said, "before Calloway does." Nathan, this woman standing in the dirt of his south field, with a notebook under her arm, mapping out his next move, 3 steps ahead of him, as naturally as breathing. "How do you always know what to do next?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Someone has to," she said simply. Nathan turned back to the trench. He looked at the water running through the new pipe, steady and purposeful, and going exactly where it was supposed to go. "I'll ride to town tomorrow," he said. "Find out who they've appointed." "Good." Margaret opened her notebook. "And we need to finish this section before dark." She was already writing. He picked up his shovel. And somewhere at the far edge of the south field, the spring ran on steady, patient, carrying everything where it needed to go. Nathan rode into Hargrove the next morning before Margaret was finished with her second cup of coffee. She heard him leave the quiet sound of the barn door, the horse's hooves on the dry ground fading toward the road, and she sat at the kitchen table with her cup and her notebook and told herself she wasn't listening for him to come back. She told herself this with the same careful dishonesty she'd been applying to most of her interior life for the past 2 weeks. She opened the notebook instead and wrote down everything she knew about bank loan transitions, which was more than most people would have expected from a seamstress from Cincinnati, because her father's farm had gone through exactly this kind of moment in 1877. Old manager retiring new manager, arriving with different ideas about what constituted acceptable risk, and she had been 22 years old, and the one who had to sit across the desk and make the case for extending credit on 42 acres of Ohio farmland. She had made that case successfully. She started making notes for Nathan's case now. He was back by noon, and the look on his face when he came through the kitchen door told her everything before he said a word. "Harlan Briggs," he said. She set down her pen. "Who is he?" "Thomas Calloway's brother-in-law." The silence that followed had the particular quality of a door closing. "When does he start?" she asked. 3 weeks. "And when is your note due?" "March. But Briggs has the authority to call it early if he determines the ranch is a poor risk." Nathan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. He put his hat on the table, which he never did. He always hung it by the door. Driscoll confirmed it, said it was purely administrative, the early call provision, standard language. But he looked at me when he said it the way a man looks at you when he's telling you something he can't say out loud. "So Calloway placed his brother-in-law in the bank," Margaret said. "And now he has a mechanism to force your hand before March." "That's the shape of it." She looked down at her notes. "How long does he need to give you the notice period for an early call?" 30 days. "So theoretically, he could have the note called by the end of next month." "Theoretically." She turned her notebook toward him. She'd been writing for 2 hours, and the page was dense with figures, revenue projections from the hotel contract, reduced feed costs from the grazing rotation, water savings from the pipe system. At this bottom, she'd drawn a line and written a single number that represented the gap between what the ranch would generate by spring and what the note required. Nathan looked at the number. "That's not enough," he said. "Not yet." She tapped the page. "But Briggs calling it early changes everything. We'd need to show the bank a credible recovery plan before he starts, not after." "Driscoll might." "Driscoll is retiring Nathan. In 3 weeks he has no authority over anything." She looked at him directly. "Is there anyone on the bank's board who isn't connected to Calloway?" He thought about it. "Judge Alderman sits on the board. He and Calloway have never been friendly." "Why not?" "Boundary dispute years back. Alderman won it in territorial court." "Could you get a meeting with Alderman?" "He's a judge." Margaret nodded. "He's a board member of a bank whose loan manager is about to be replaced by the competing landowner's family member. If he has half a brain, he's already uncomfortable about it." She folded her hands on the table. "I think you should go see him." Nathan looked at her. "You've been awake since before dawn working this out," he said. It wasn't a question. "I had trouble sleeping." Again. She didn't answer that. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. "All right," he said. "I'll go see Alderman." "Today," she said. "Today. Every day you wait is a day. Calloway has more time to manage the situation his way." He picked up his hat. She stood up and went to the counter and wrapped the leftover cornbread from breakfast in a cloth and handed it to him. "You haven't eaten since this morning," she said. He looked at the cornbread. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She sat back down and picked up her pen before he could see her face, and he went out the door, and she heard the horse again fading toward town, and she sat there in the kitchen and breathed slowly, and told herself she was only worried about the ranch. She was an excellent liar when she needed to be. Judge Alderman received Nathan in his office above the Land Records Hall that afternoon, and within 5 minutes, Nathan understood that Margaret had been exactly right. Alderman had been watching the Briggs appointment with the tight expression of a man who knew something was wrong and hadn't yet decided how loudly to say so. "Sit down, Cole," Alderman said. He was a large man, 60s, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by human behavior sometime around 1865. "I heard you went to see Driscoll this morning. Word travels fast. In a valley this size." Alderman's mouth twitched. "What's on your mind?" Nathan laid out the situation plainly. The note, the debt, the recovery plan. Margaret had constructed the hotel contract, the water system, the grazing rotation. He put the figures on the desk. He did not mention Calloway by name. He let the numbers and the timeline speak for themselves, and he watched Alderman's face as he read. Alderman read for a long time. He was thorough. He turned back twice to recheck figures. "Where did these projections come from?" he asked. "I have someone helping me manage the operation," Nathan said. "Someone with a head for numbers." "Yes, sir." Alderman set the papers down. He looked at Nathan with the level appraisal of a man who had spent 30 years deciding what was true. "The recovery plan is solid," he said. "Better than solid. If these numbers hold, you're not a poor risk. You're a good one." He paused. "The question is whether anyone with the authority to say so will be in a position to say so in 3 weeks. I know. I sit on that board, Cole. I know that too." Alderman was quiet for a moment. "Come back Friday with the full documentation," he said. "Supply contract from Pierce Water System costs grazing records. Everything." He picked up his pen. "I can't promise you anything, but I can promise that an early call on a note without cause is the kind of thing a board member can raise questions about." Nathan rode back to the ranch with something in his chest he hadn't felt all day. Not relief exactly, more like the feeling of ground solidifying slightly under a foot you'd placed carefully. He told Margaret everything that evening. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She normally asked clarifying questions throughout. She waited until he was finished. "He's going to help you," she said. "He said he couldn't promise. He told you to come back Friday with full documentation and said he could raise questions at the board level." She looked at him steadily. "That's a man who's already decided to help you. He's just covering himself appropriately." Nathan considered this. "You read people," he said. "I've had practice. Is it always this fast?" She thought about that. "Some people are harder. You were harder." He raised an eyebrow. "The first day," she said carefully. "I couldn't tell if you were a man who'd given up or a man who just wasn't being given the right tools. They look similar from the outside." She paused. "I decided by the second morning it was the tools. When you walked the property at 5 in the morning, you had good soil and an empty garden and a fence that needed 3 days of work, not the month it would have taken someone doing it alone. That's not a man who'd given up. That's a man who'd run out of—" She stopped. "Of what?" She looked at the table. "Of someone to build it with," she said quietly. The kitchen was very still. Nathan didn't move. He sat with the weight of that sentence and felt it settle somewhere deep, the way true things settled. "Margaret," he said. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly, just carefully. The way she did everything. "I wasn't going to say anything you'd need to." "I know." She stood up and took her cup to the wash basin. "It's just there's a lot still unsettled. The bank, Calloway. The harvest isn't in yet." She kept her back to him. "I don't want to. I think it's better to keep things clear until things are clearer." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She turned around. Her face was composed again, the careful composure she wore like armor, but her eyes were doing something different, and they both knew it. "Friday," she said. "I'll have the documentation ready." "I know you will." She went to bed. He sat at the table for another hour, not reading the papers in front of him, just sitting. Then something happened that changed everything. He was getting up to blow out the lamp when he noticed the second letter. It was sitting under his copy of Margaret's revenue projections, where it must have been placed when she set the papers on the table earlier, or perhaps he hadn't noticed it before, he couldn't be certain. It was a letter in an envelope unsealed, addressed to no one in particular. And it was in Eleanor's handwriting. Or mostly Eleanor's handwriting. He recognized the difference now. He shouldn't have read it. He knew that. It was not addressed to him. It might have been something Margaret carried with her and set down without thinking, one of Eleanor's letters she'd kept after. He read the first line without intending to, and then he couldn't stop. It was a letter Eleanor had written during the last weeks of her illness. He could tell from the writing's increasing fragility, and it was addressed to Margaret. Not to Nathan. It was Eleanor writing to her sister, and in it Eleanor said things that made Nathan sit back down slowly in his chair. "You've been writing his letters for 3 weeks now, Maggie, and you think I don't notice how different your face is when you read his replies. You think I don't see you. I always see you. You've been in love with a man you've never met, and you don't even know it yet. And I love you so much, and I am so sorry I can't. I wanted to meet him. I wanted to meet you both in the same room. I think it would have been something. Promise me you'll go. Not just to tell him. Go and stay long enough to give yourself a real chance. You've been taking care of everyone else your whole life, Maggie. Someone should take care of you. I think maybe he's the kind of person who could if you'd let him. If you'd stop organizing everything long enough to let something happen to you. Don't leave too fast. Promise me." Nathan set the letter down. He sat very still for a very long time. Then he picked it up again and read the last part. "I know you, Maggie. You'll find a reason to leave before anything can really start. You'll call it practicality, and it will break my heart even from wherever I end up. Please don't. Please just stay long enough to see." He folded the letter very carefully and placed it exactly where he had found it under the revenue projections. He went to bed. He did not mention it in the morning. I was not sure he would ever mention it. It felt like something that belonged to Margaret and Eleanor alone, a conversation between sisters that he had stumbled into and needed to carry quietly. But something in him had shifted the way shifts had been happening since the moment she stepped off that train, each one small and each one permanent. He knew now that Eleanor had seen it before either of them had. He knew now that Margaret had not stayed on this ranch purely out of practical concern. And he knew now that whatever patience was required of him, he would be patient because some things were worth exactly that. Friday came. Nathan went to see Alderman with a folder of documentation that was organized with a precision that impressed even Alderman, who had been reading legal documents for 30 years. "This is thorough work," Alderman said. "Yes, sir. The hotel contract alone is strong. Pierce countersigned it. Yesterday." Alderman turned a page. "And the water system, this is operational. Fully. First irrigation cycle ran last week." Alderman nodded slowly, turning pages. Then he stopped. "Cole," he said, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right." "Thomas Calloway came to see me yesterday." Nathan went still. He suggested. Alderman continued carefully that the improvement in your ranch's situation was largely attributable to a woman staying on your property, whose presence he characterized as, and I'm quoting him, irregular. Alderman looked up. "He implied the documentation I'd be seeing today was produced by someone other than yourself, and that the financial projections might be considered optimistic fabrications produced by someone with a personal interest in the outcome." The silence in Alderman's office was absolute. "He's saying Margaret falsified the numbers," Nathan said. "He's implying it. The hotel contract is real. Pierce signed it. I know. I've already spoken to Pierce." Alderman set the folder down. "Cole, I'm going to be straight with you. Calloway can't stop me from raising questions at the board level. What he can do is create enough doubt about the integrity of your documentation that other board members get nervous." He paused. "He's suggesting your manager has a conflict of interest." "She works for me. She arrived on a train meant to deliver a mail-order bride," Alderman said not unkindly. "Calloway knows that. He's been very thorough in gathering information." Nathan felt something cold move through him. Not fear, something closer to anger, but colder. The specific anger of a man watching someone he cared about be made into a weapon against something she'd built with her own hands. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need the projections verified independently," Alderman said. "I'm not saying I doubt them. I'm saying I need them to come from a source Calloway can't question." He paused. "Is there anyone in the county who could review Miss Hayes's work and put their name to it?" Nathan thought. He thought for a long time. Calvin Marsh, he said finally. He runs the agricultural extension out of Billings. He came through the valley 2 years ago, gave a talk on crop rotation, knows his figures. Could you get Marsh to review the projections? I can try. Get him to review them. Alderman leaned back in his chair. And Cole, whatever the nature of your arrangement with Miss Hayes, I'd suggest you be very clear-eyed about it. Calloway is going to use every angle he can find. Nathan picked up his hat. I'm clear-eyed about it, he said. He drove back to the ranch and walked into the kitchen, and Margaret looked at his face and put down her pen. What happened? She said. He told her everything. He watched her face as he talked, the stillness that came over it, the particular quality of composure that was not calm, but control, the way she went, very still when he got to the part about Calloway characterizing her work as a fabrication. When he finished, she was quiet for a full 10 seconds. He went to Alderman before you did, she said. He must have gone the same afternoon I was there. He's been watching us more closely than I realized. She stood up. She went to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment. He's not trying to buy the ranch anymore. He's trying to discredit the recovery, so the board has no choice but to call the note. That's how I read it. She turned around. Marsh, she said immediately. Calvin Marsh at the Agricultural Extension. Nathan stared at her. How do you know about Marsh? He said. I wrote to him 2 weeks ago, she said. You what? I wanted an independent review of the grazing rotation plan before I presented it to you as a savings measure. I didn't want to give you numbers I wasn't certain of. She went to the chest by the far wall, her own small organized corner of the kitchen, and produced a folded letter. He wrote back last week. He confirmed the rotation analysis and said the projected savings were, and I'm quoting him, conservative by 10 to 15%. Nathan took the letter. He read it. He read it again. You have a signed letter from Calvin Marsh confirming your projections are conservative. I have a signed letter from Calvin Marsh confirming the grazing analysis, she said. The rest he'd need to review, but it's a starting point. Nathan looked at her. This woman who had 2 weeks ago written to an agricultural extension expert to independently verify her own work before presenting it. Not to protect herself. She hadn't known she would need protection. She'd done it because she didn't want to give him numbers she wasn't certain of. He felt something so large move through him that he had to set it aside, or it would have swallowed the conversation. I'll ride to Billings Monday, he said. Ask Marsh to come review the full documentation. I can write ahead to him today, she said. If he knows you're coming, he can set time aside. Do that. She sat down and started writing. He watched her for a moment. The quick, sure strokes of her pen, the focused line between her brows, the way she wrote, the way she did everything without wasting a single motion. Margaret, he said. Calloway is going to keep coming. I know. It won't just be the bank. He'll find other angles. She looked up. Let him, she said. There was something in her voice he hadn't heard before, not hard exactly, but settled. Like a woman who had decided something and was done deciding. He's going to make it personal, Nathan said. About you being here, about why you're here. People can think what they want to think. Some of what they think will be unkind. She held his gaze. Nathan, she said. I managed a dying man's farm in Ohio for 4 years, while people told me a woman couldn't do it. I buried my father, then I buried my sister, and I traveled 1,000 miles alone to deliver a letter to a stranger. She paused. Thomas Calloway doesn't frighten me. The kitchen was very quiet. All right, he said. She went back to writing. He picked up his hat and went to do the afternoon chores, and he was halfway to the barn when something made him turn around and look back at the house. At the window where she sat writing her head, bent, her pen moving. He stood there for the moment he couldn't account for. Then he went to work. Monday, Nathan rode to Billings. He left before sunrise, and Margaret stood in the barn doorway and handed him a wrapped package of food for the road, and the letter she'd written to Marsh, and a list of 3 other things to attend to in Billings while he was there, because Margaret didn't let a trip go to waste. He was back by Tuesday evening. Calvin Marsh would come Thursday. Margaret spent Wednesday reorganizing every piece of documentation they had: hotel contract, water system cost records, grazing rotation logs, soil assessment, harvest projections, into a sequence so logical and so clearly cross-referenced that Marsh would be able to follow the entire recovery narrative without a single question needing answering. She worked until past midnight. Nathan came downstairs at 11 and found her at the table and didn't say anything, just made coffee and set a cup beside her and went back to bed. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, and her hand paused over the paper for just a moment before she kept writing. Marsh arrived Thursday in a hired buggy from the billing stage, a lean, dry-voiced man in his 50s who looked at the documentation Margaret had prepared and spent 4 hours going through it without speaking, except to ask for specific records, which Margaret produced from organized folders without having to search for anything. At the end of 4 hours, Marsh looked up. "Where did you study?" he said. "I didn't," Margaret said. He looked at her for a moment. "These rotation calculations use a methodology I taught at the Chicago Agricultural Convention in 1881, he said. "It's not widely published. How did you arrive at it independently?" "I worked it out from first principles," she said. 42 acres in Ohio, 4 years of managing the numbers. You find efficiencies, or you don't eat." Marsh looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Nathan. "Your numbers are right," he said. "The projections are conservative. The recovery plan is sound." He picked up his pen. "I'll put my name to it." Nathan let out a breath he'd been holding since Monday. Margaret did not visibly react. She simply opened the folder for the signature page, placed it in front of Marsh, and waited. But her hand, Nathan noticed, was not entirely steady when she slid the page across the table. He didn't say anything. After Marsh left, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the signed documentation between them, and for a little while neither of them spoke. Then Margaret said very quietly, "I found a letter." Nathan went still. "One of Eleanor's," she said. She was looking at the table. "I've been carrying it. I must have left it here last week under the papers." The silence stretched. "I saw it," Nathan said. She looked up. "I didn't mean to read it," he said. "I read the first line and then I couldn't stop." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry. It wasn't mine to read." She was very still. "You read all of it," she said. Not a question. "Yes." Her hands were flat on the table. She was looking at him with an expression he had no name for. Not anger, not relief, something more complicated than either. "She always saw things before I did," Margaret said finally. The words came out careful and a little rough. "It used to frustrate me. She'd look at a situation I'd been staring at for weeks, and she'd say the obvious thing, and it would turn out to be obvious." "She saw what she saw," Nathan said quietly. "She wasn't wrong," Margaret said. The admission seemed to cost her something. Her voice was very even, and her eyes were very bright. "She wasn't wrong about any of it. I knew it before I was halfway across Iowa, and I kept telling myself it was obligation, it was practicality. It was just that the ranch needed—" "Margaret," she stopped. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Just that." He didn't say anything else. He just put his hand over hers and let it sit there and let her decide what to do with it. She looked at their hands on the table. She turned hers over slowly, and her fingers closed around his, and she held on with the grip of a woman who had been carrying things alone for so long that holding on to something felt almost like the bravest thing she'd ever done. They sat like that for a long time. Outside, the wind was picking up. Neither of them noticed it. At first, they were too occupied with the quiet revolution happening at the kitchen table. The small, enormous thing of Margaret Hayes finally letting herself hold on instead of letting go. But by the time Nathan looked up and glanced toward the window, the evening light had gone a strange color. He stood up. I went to the door and opened it and stood in the doorway, looking at the sky to the northwest. And Margaret, still at the table, saw the change in his posture. The sudden alertness, every line of him gone tight and focused. "Nathan," she said. "Storm," he said. She came to stand beside him. The sky to the northwest was the specific dark green-black that meant something serious, the color she'd learned to fear during 4 Ohio harvests. It was moving fast. The air had that particular stillness that preceded a serious storm, the world holding its breath. "How long?" she said. 2 hours, maybe less. He was already moving. "The hay in the south field, I cut it yesterday, it's still down." "Go," she said. "I'll get the horses in." "Margaret." "Go," she said. "I know how to get horses in. Go get your hay." He went. She ran to the barn. What happened in the next 90 minutes was the kind of work that stripped away everything that wasn't essential. No time for careful composure. No time for managed distance. Just Margaret running between the barn and the pasture, getting animals in, checking the barn, door latches moving. Feet away from the section of roof she'd noticed was weak, doing it all with the fast, practical efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how little time there was. Nathan got most of the hay, not all of it. The storm hit before he could get the last quarter of the south field cut and stacked, and when it hit hard. Not a tornado, but close enough, the kind of plain storm that didn't announce itself and didn't negotiate. Rain horizontal. Wind that meant business. Nathan made it back to the barn just ahead of the worst of it and found Margaret already there. All 4 horses secured, the feed moved, a lantern lit. She was soaked through. So was he. They stood in the barn, listening to the storm work itself out against the roof, and after a moment, Nathan sat down on the nearest hay bale because his legs had decided they'd done enough. Margaret sat down across from him. "The south field," she said. "Lost about a quarter of what I cut. Maybe less." "That's recoverable," she said, immediately calculating. "The rotation gives us buffer. We can adjust." "I know." "The barn roof held." "Yes." "The horses are fine." "Yes." He looked at her. She had hay in her hair and mud on her boots and a cut on her right hand she probably hadn't noticed yet, and she was running losses against projections in her head while sitting soaked through on a hay bale in a Montana storm. And he looked at her and felt something so clear and so certain move through him that it nearly took his breath. "You're bleeding," he said. She looked at her hand. "Oh." She turned it over. "I must have caught the latch." He found the cloth he kept on the barn shelf and crossed to her, and she held out her hand without comment, and he wrapped it and tied it off, and she watched him do it with an expression that was trying very hard to be practical and was not entirely succeeding. "Margaret," he said. He was still holding her hand. "It's fine," she said. "It's not deep." "That's not what I was going to say." She looked at him. "I read Eleanor's letter," he said, "and I've had 4 days to decide whether I was going to say anything about it or carry it quietly and wait for you to come to it on your own." He paused. "I'm not that patient." "Nathan." "I know you said to keep things clear until things are clearer," he said. "The bank isn't settled, and Callaway isn't finished, and the harvest isn't in. I know all of that." He looked at her steadily. "None of it changes what I know." She looked at him in the lantern light with the storm loud against the barn walls, and her hand wrapped in his cloth and hay in her hair. "What do you know?" she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I know," he said, "that you came to this ranch to deliver a letter and leave. I know you stayed because things needed fixing, and I know," he paused, "that the ranch isn't the only reason you stayed." The silence between them was the loudest thing in the barn. "No," she said finally, barely audible. "It isn't." He lifted his free hand and removed a piece of hay from her hair very gently, and her breath went slightly unsteady, in a way she couldn't regulate. "Then we know the same thing," he said. He did not kiss her. He was a careful man, and she was a careful woman, and they had both been managing fragile things for long enough to know that the right moment required the right ground under it. But he stayed where he was, close, and she did not move away. And they sat in the barn while the storm moved through and the lantern burned steady and the horses shifted quietly in their stalls. Outside, the storm was doing damage. Inside, something was being built. When the worst of it passed and Nathan went out to check the barn roof and the fences, Margaret stood in the barn doorway and watched him go, the set of his shoulders, the way he moved in the dark, with the confident practicality of a man who knew his land. And she pressed Eleanor's letter, which she'd carried in her apron pocket all day, against her palm. Stay long enough to see, Eleanor had written. She was seeing. She was staying. Tomorrow, there would be damage to assess, and Calloway to outmaneuver, and board members to convince, and a harvest to bring in. Tomorrow, there would be a dozen things that needed doing, and she would do them, and Nathan would do them, and they would do them together the way they had been doing everything together for 3 weeks. But tonight, the storm was passing, and Nathan Cole was walking back across the wet ground toward the barn where she stood. And when he saw her in the doorway, he didn't slow down or speed up, just kept his same steady pace, and there was something in his face in the dark that she felt in the center of her chest, like a hand pressing gently on something that had been locked shut for a very long time. Roof held, he said. Good, she said. East fence has a section down. We'll fix it in the morning. Yes. He stopped in front of her, close. We will. She looked at him. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. They went inside together, and the door closed behind them, and the storm finished its business and moved east toward other country, and the ranch was quiet. The east fence took most of the following morning to repair. Nathan worked the post driver, and Margaret held the wire taut, and they didn't talk much, but it was the comfortable kind of quiet that had replaced the careful kind somewhere in the past week, without either of them marking the exact moment it happened. The storm had knocked out 40 feet of fencing and bent 2 posts beyond saving. And by the time they finished, the sun was high, and both of them were tired in the clean way that came from work completed rather than work avoided. Walking back toward the house. Nathan said, Alderman sent word this morning. Board meets next Wednesday. Margaret looked at him. That's faster than I expected. Alderman moved it up. He wouldn't say why in the note, but moving it up is either very good or very bad. It's good, she said. If he'd lost the argument, he would have let it run its natural course. Accelerating it means he has the votes to do something, and he wants to do it before Briggs officially takes over. You get all that from a 2-line note. I get that from knowing how men like aldermen operate. She wiped her hands on her work cloth. He's been on that board for 20 years. He doesn't move fast unless he's certain. Nathan held the barn door for her. You should come with me, he said. She stopped. To the board meeting. You built the recovery plan. Marsh can verify the numbers, but he can't answer questions about operational decisions. Only you can do that. She thought about it. Calloway will be there, she said. Almost certainly. He'll try to use my presence against you. The irregular arrangement, the conflict of interest. Let him try. Nathan's voice was steady. You're the ranch manager. Managers attend relevant meetings. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. I'll come. She spent Sunday and Monday preparing. She organized the full documentation package into 3 copies, one for aldermen, one for the general board, one for herself, and she wrote a 2-page summary of the recovery timeline that she rehearsed in her head until she could recite every figure without looking at the page. She was not nervous exactly. She was the way she got before difficult things, very quiet, very focused, all her energy gathered inward. Nathan watched her work and didn't interrupt. Tuesday evening, she set down her pen and looked at him across the table. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Something in her voice made him put down his coffee. Before the meeting, she said. Before you hear it from someone else. She folded her hands on the table. When I was helping Eleanor write the letters, the later ones, the ones she couldn't manage herself, I wasn't just transcribing what she told me to say. I know that, he said. Some of what I wrote was... She stopped, started again. Eleanor would tell me the general idea and I would write it. But sometimes I wrote things she didn't specifically ask me to. Things I... She pressed her lips together. Things I wanted to say. To you. Without knowing you'd ever know it was me. Nathan was very still. Which ones? He said. The letter about the garden, she said quietly. Eleanor never cared much about gardens. That was mine. And the one about the difference between loneliness and solitude. and the last one before Eleanor got too ill to direct anything at all. She looked at the table. That one was entirely mine. Eleanor told me to write you a letter, and I sat for an hour, and then I wrote what I actually felt, and I sent it under her name, and I have felt guilty about it every day since. The kitchen was very still. I remember that letter, Nathan said. She looked up. I read it 4 times, he said. It was the one that made me certain I was making the right decision coming to the platform. He paused. What did you say in it? What were you actually saying? She looked at him for a long moment. I said that I thought 2 people could build something real if they were both willing to stop pretending they didn't need anyone. Her voice was careful. I said that needing someone wasn't weakness, that it was just honest. She paused. I said I was tired of being practical about everything and not allowing myself to want what I actually wanted. The silence after that was the particular kind that had weight and heat to it. You were writing about yourself, Nathan said. Yes, and you sent it to me. Yes. She looked down. And then Eleanor died and I came here and you were exactly who the letters made me think you'd be, which made everything considerably more complicated. Nathan leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. Margaret, he said, I need you to understand something. His voice was quiet and very deliberate. I am not angry. I want to be clear about that first, because you're sitting there waiting for me to be angry, and I'm not going to be. She met his eyes. What I am, he said, is relieved, because it means that the letter I read 4 times and kept in my coat for 3 weeks was actually written by the woman sitting across from me. And that means nothing that happened between us was built on something false. He paused. It was built on something true that just hadn't introduced itself yet. Margaret looked at him for a long time. Her composure, which was formidable, did something at the edges. That's a generous way to look at it, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. It's the accurate way. He picked up his coffee. Now, the meeting is tomorrow. Tell me what you're going to say when Calloway tries to discredit the projections. She blinked. Then she straightened. Then she picked up her pen. I'm going to let Marcia's letter speak first, she said. And then I'm going to show them the hotel contract. And then I'm going to explain the water system in terms of dollar savings per annum, because board members understand dollars better than pipe grades. She was writing as she talked. And if Calloway says the numbers are fabricated, I'm going to ask him to identify specifically which figures he disputes and on what basis. And I'm going to have the underlying documentation for every single one. And if he makes it personal, she looked up. Let him, she said. Same words he'd used, same tone. He almost smiled. Get some sleep, he said. In a while. He went to bed and she kept working, and somewhere around midnight she finally closed the notebook and sat in the quiet kitchen and let herself feel for just a moment the weight of what tomorrow was. Not fear. Something more like the feeling before a storm that held breath quality of the world on the edge of something. She thought about Eleanor. She thought about what Eleanor would have said, sitting across this table, watching her younger sister's plans spread over the surface in organized stacks. Eleanor would have said something that made everything seem less serious. She would have found the humor in it. Margaret Hayes, seamstress from Cincinnati, about to walk into a Montana bank board meeting to defend a cattle ranch recovery plan. Eleanor would have laughed and then said something true and kind in the same breath the way she always did. You're the bravest person I know, Maggie. You just don't know it because you're always too busy being practical. Margaret pressed her hand flat on the table. All right, Ellie, she said quietly to the empty kitchen. All right. She went to bed. The board meeting was held in the back room of the Hargrove Bank, a room that smelled of old paper and made Margaret think of every administrative space where important things had been decided by people who confused formality with authority. There were 7 board members at the long table. Alderman was at the far end. Harlan Briggs sat 2 seats from the head already installed, though not yet officially the loan manager, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about how Thomas Calloway operated. Calloway himself was not on the board. But he was in the room, seated against the back wall as a concerned community member who had requested the right to observe, which apparently no one had thought to refuse him. Margaret noted this and said nothing. She and Nathan sat on one side of a smaller table facing the board. She had the documentation folder in front of her. Nathan had his hat in his hands. Alderman opened the proceedings with the dry efficiency of a man who had chaired many such meetings and wanted this one over with. He presented the situation clearly. Nathan Cole's existing note, Driscoll's retirement, the question of whether the note was adequately secured, given the ranch's current condition. He did not mention Briggs's relationship to Calloway. He didn't need to. Two of the board members shifted slightly in their seats when Briggs's name was read into the record, which meant they already knew. Mr. Cole has submitted a recovery documentation package, Alderman said, including a third-party assessment from Calvin Marsh of the Billings Agricultural Extension. He nodded to Margaret. Miss Hayes, as the ranch's operational manager, prepared the underlying analysis. I've asked her to be available for questions. Harlan Briggs looked up from his papers for the first time. How was younger than Margaret had expected, mid-40s, soft in the way of men who had always had someone else's resources to draw on, with the kind of confidence that came from connection rather than competence. He looked at her the way Calloway had looked at her, the swift downward assessment, the recalibration. Miss Hayes, he said, you're the woman staying at the Cole Ranch. I'm the ranch manager, yes, Margaret said. Arrived on a train from Cincinnati approximately a month ago. 5 weeks ago, yes. And in 5 weeks you produced this. He held up the documentation package, recovery analysis. The analysis reflects conditions that existed before I arrived, Margaret said. I identified them and quantified them. The underlying potential was always there. Quite a coincidence, Briggs said pleasantly, that a seamstress from Ohio arrives with no connection to the territory, and within 5 weeks produces a financial recovery plan that happens to resolve a debt situation of considerable magnitude. The coincidence, Margaret said equally pleasantly, is that the person who happened to arrive had the relevant background. I managed 42 acres in Ohio for 4 years. I understand agricultural economics. As a seamstress, as a farmer's daughter who kept the farm running while her father was dying, the seamstress work came after. She set her hands flat on the table. Mr. Briggs, I notice you haven't disputed a specific figure. If you have a specific objection to the analysis, I'd welcome the opportunity to address it with the underlying documentation. A very small silence. One of the older board members, a man named Hewitt, that Margaret had identified from Nathan's brief descriptions as generally reasonable, cleared his throat. Let's look at the hotel contract, Hewitt said. They looked at the hotel contract. Then they looked at Marsh's letter. Then Briggs tried a different angle. The water system, he said. This pipe installation, what did that cost? Margaret gave him the figure. That's a significant expenditure for a ranch carrying this level of debt. It's an investment that reduces summer water loss by an estimated 40% and enables the kitchen garden operation that generates the hotel revenue, Margaret said. The system pays for itself in 14 months at current projections. At current projections, Briggs repeated, which you produced, which Calvin Marsh reviewed and characterized as conservative by 10 to 15%. She slid Marsh's letter across the table. His signature is at the bottom. Another silence. Calloway shifted against the back wall. Margaret did not look at him. Alderman was watching the room with the careful attention of a man counting votes in his head. I have a question, said the board member on Alderman's left, a woman named Clara Dent, who ran the dry goods supply and had said nothing until now. She was looking at Margaret with an expression that was not hostile. It was appraising. Miss Hayes, you said you arrived to deliver news about the original arrangement, the mail order situation. Yes, ma'am. And you stayed on as manager. Yes. Why? The room was very quiet. Margaret considered the question for exactly 1 second. Because the ranch was fixable, she said. And it bothered me to see fixable things not getting fixed. Clara Dent looked at her for a long moment. And the fact that you stayed has nothing to do with the financial outcome you're describing, Briggs said. No personal stake. I'm paid a manager's wage, Margaret said. That's my stake. It's a legitimate one. And if the bank calls the note early, Briggs said, you lose your position. If the bank calls the note early without cause, Margaret said, Nathan Cole loses his ranch. That's the relevant consideration. The air in the room changed slightly. Hewitt looked at Briggs. Clara Dent looked at Alderman. Alderman said in the mildest voice he'd used all morning. Briggs, do you have a specific procedural basis for recommending early recall of this note? Briggs straightened. The recovery plan is speculative. The recovery plan is verified by Calvin Marsh, Alderman said. Do you have a basis independent of the general uncertainty of agricultural projections, which applies to every farming note this bank holds? A beat. The irregular nature of the operational arrangement. The operational arrangement, Clara Dent said, is a ranch manager managing a ranch. What's irregular about that? Calloway stood up from the back wall. Every head in the room turned. I'd like to speak, he said. You're here as an observer, Thomas, Alderman said, not a participant. This situation affects the whole valley. You're here as an observer. Alderman's voice did not change in volume or temperature, but something in it closed a door. Sit down. Calloway sat down. It was the first time Nathan thought that he had ever seen Thomas Calloway sit down when someone told him to. The vote when it came was 5-2. The note would not be called early. The existing terms would stand through March, at which point the recovery plan would be reviewed on its merits. Briggs voted against. One other board member Nathan didn't recognize voted against. Everyone else voted with Alderman. Margaret wrote the outcome in her notebook precisely and without expression, and Nathan sat beside her and kept his face neutral until they were outside on the boardwalk in the September air, and then he stopped walking and turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him. 5-2, she said. 5-2, he agreed. Something moved through her face, not a smile yet, but its predecessor, something luminous, starting underneath the composure. Alderman had the votes before we walked in, she said. He moved the meeting up because he was sure. I know. Clara Dent was never going to vote with Briggs. She doesn't like Calloway. The dry goods supply Calloway undercut her contract 2 years ago, and she's been waiting to return the favor. Did you know that going in? I found it out yesterday. I asked the woman at the postal drop who the board members were. She paused. It's useful to know who has reasons. He looked at her. You found that out yesterday, he said. I had time in the afternoon. While you were also finishing the documentation. It wasn't complicated conversation. I asked, she told me. He shook his head slowly. She looked up at him, and that thing that had been building underneath her composure finally broke the surface. The luminous thing, the thing that was made of relief, and something warmer than relief. We won, she said, as if she needed to say it out loud to believe it. We won? He said. She laughed. A real laugh, the kind she'd given him in the pasture weeks ago, surprised out of her, genuine and unguarded. And Nathan Cole, who had been waiting for exactly that since the last time he heard it, felt something in his chest open like a room whose door had been stuck for years. He took her hand. Right there on the boardwalk in front of the Hargrove Bank, in front of anyone who happened to be walking by. He took her hand and held it. Not dramatically, just firmly, the way a man holds something he intends to keep. She looked down at their hands. She looked up at him. She did not let go. Behind them the bank door opened, and Calloway came out. Nathan heard him stop, heard the brief loaded silence of a man recalculating, and then heard his footsteps move away down the boardwalk without a word. Nathan didn't turn around. He's not done, Margaret said quietly. No. Nathan agreed. The harvest isn't in yet. He'll find another angle. Probably. We should be ready for Margaret. His hand tightened slightly around hers. Can we have 10 minutes where we're not being ready for something? She looked at him. Something softened in her face. 10 minutes, she said. They walked down the boardwalk towards the hotel, still hand in hand, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was the good kind of quiet, now the kind that didn't need filling. At the corner by the hotel, Gerald Pierce came out and saw them, and nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose investment was looking sound. Miss Hayes, he said. Cole. First delivery next week. Tuesday, Margaret said. Good. Pierce looked between them with the friendly curiosity of a man who had noticed things. You two look like you've had a decent morning. Decent enough, Nathan said. Pierce went back inside. They stood at the corner. The first tomatoes will be ready in 10 days, Margaret said. I know. The second planting should follow 2 weeks after. I know. And the grazing rotation needs to shift by the end of the month, or we lose the efficiency gain on the south pasture. Margaret. The east fence we should add 2 more posts before winter. The ground will be too hard after November. Margaret. She stopped. 10 minutes isn't up yet, he said. She looked at him. She pressed her lips together and looked away and then back. I'm not good at this, she said. At just being, without something to manage. I know. I've been managing things since I was 22. I know that too. It's not a character flaw, it's just how I... Margaret. He turned to face her fully. I know. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you for 10 minutes. He looked at her steadily. After that, you can manage whatever you like. She held his gaze. Then she took a breath and let it out slowly and visibly, deliberately set down the invisible weight she was carrying. The way you'd set down a bag. You'd been so long holding, you'd forgotten it was in your hand. All right, she said. They stood at the corner in the September morning, and the 10 minutes passed, and neither of them counted them. When they drove back to the ranch that afternoon, the valley spread out around them in the particular gold of late summer, and the silence between them on the wagon seat was different from any silence they'd shared before. Not careful, not managed, not the silence of 2 people avoiding something. It was the silence of 2 people who had arrived somewhere and were taking a moment to recognize it. Halfway home, Margaret said, I want to write to Eleanor's grave. Nathan looked at her. A letter, she said. I know she can't read it, but I want to tell her. She stopped. Her voice was doing that slightly not steady thing. I want to tell her she was right. She'd want to know she was right. She'd want to know you're all right, Nathan said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. That too. He reached over without looking away from the road and covered her hand with his. She turned hers over and held on. The ranch came into view around the last bend. The repaired fence, the garden in its late summer fullness, the pipe running its steady invisible line from the spring to where the water was needed. Everything they'd built over 5 weeks of early mornings and long evenings, and arguing over figures and working beside each other in the particular rhythm they'd fallen into, like it had always been there waiting for them. It looks different than when I arrived, Margaret said. It is different. You can't fix a place from the outside in, she said almost to herself. You have to fix it from... She stopped. From inside, he said. Yes. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the barn. Neither of them moved immediately. I need to ask you something, Nathan said. She looked at him. The manager arrangement, he said carefully. Through harvest. That's what we agreed. Yes. Harvest will be done by October. Yes. And then, he said. The word sat between them smaller than everything it contained. Margaret looked at the ranch, at the garden, at the fences at the house with the window that faced east where she'd slept for 5 weeks and started somewhere in the second week to think of as hers. I don't know, she said honestly. That's not a no, he said. She looked at him. No, she said. It isn't. He nodded. He climbed down from the wagon and went to see to the horse, and she sat for a moment longer with the question still hanging in the air. Then she climbed down too and went inside and put the coffee on and started thinking about the October harvest numbers. But something had changed in the way she thought about them. She was calculating for 2 now. She'd been doing it for weeks, and she was only now admitting it to herself. She was calculating for a future. She was calculating for here. 3 days later, Calloway made his next move. It came not at the bank and not in person, but through a letter delivered to the ranch addressed to Margaret from a lawyer in Billings named Horace Webb. Margaret opened it at the kitchen table while Nathan was in the barn, and she read it twice before she let herself react to what it said. Webb wrote on behalf of a client unnamed who was interested in formally contesting the authenticity of the documentation submitted to the Hargrove Bank Board, on the grounds that the author of said documentation had misrepresented her professional credentials and her personal relationship to the property and its owner. In plain terms, someone was threatening to accuse her of fraud. She set the letter down on the table. She picked it up again. She read the third paragraph, which was the one that mattered. The unnamed client was prepared to withdraw the complaint in exchange for Nathan Cole's agreement to accept a purchase offer for the ranch at the previously stated price. Calloway's offer. In writing through a lawyer, with her reputation as the leverage. She sat for a long time. She thought about Ohio. She thought about 42 acres and a sick father and 4 years of making things work when they shouldn't have been able to work. She thought about a train platform and a letter and a man with the straight back and the worn hat who hadn't turned her away when he had every reason to. She thought about Eleanor. "You're the bravest person I know, Maggie." She picked up her pen. She started writing. Not a response to Webb. Not yet. First, she needed to write down everything she remembered about the bank board meeting. Every word Briggs had said. Every angle Calloway had shown, every piece of the documentation she'd prepared. She needed it on paper while it was fresh in the form she'd need if this went somewhere official. Nathan came in from the barn and found her writing. "You've been in here an hour," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I need to show you something." He sat. She handed him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his face go very still, not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of someone whose worst expectation has been confirmed. "He's threatening you," Nathan said. "He's threatening the documentation, which means he's threatening the board's decision. He's threatening you." Nathan's voice had gone quiet in the way it went quiet when something mattered. "If Webb files a formal complaint, your name gets attached to a fraud allegation, even if you're cleared." "I know." "Margaret." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it for an hour, and I want to tell you my thinking, and then I want you to tell me what you think, and then we're going to decide together." She looked at him across the table. "Can you do that? Just listen first." He set the letter down. "Go ahead," he said. "Calloway is doing this because he lost at the bank," she said. "Which means the bank decision hurt him. Which means the recovery plan threatened something real. That's important. It means we're stronger than he wanted us to be." She paused. "He's not attacking the ranch anymore. He's attacking me because I'm the part he thinks is weakest. He thinks if he makes my position here untenable, you'll have to settle." "He's wrong," Nathan said. "He doesn't know that yet." She tapped the letter. "Webb says the complaint can be withdrawn if you accept the offer. That tells us Calloway still wants the land more than he wants to hurt us, which means we have leverage." "What leverage?" "Briggs," she said. "He voted against you at that board meeting. If we can establish that Briggs's vote was influenced by his relationship to Calloway, which is a matter of public record, their family, then the board decision isn't just valid, it's a precedent. And threatening to contest it by attacking the documentation author is the kind of thing that could look very bad for a brand new bank manager trying to establish himself." She looked at Nathan steadily. "Briggs doesn't know Calloway well enough to die on this hill for him. He took the vote because Calloway asked him to, and it seemed low risk. This is higher risk. You want to go to Briggs?" "I want to go to Briggs and have a quiet, reasonable conversation about professional reputations and the kind of scrutiny that tends to follow loan managers who get involved in land acquisition schemes." She paused. "I want to do this before Calloway tells Briggs what he's already done." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "You worked all of this out in an hour," he said. "I had time to think." "Margaret." She stopped. "Are you all right?" he said. "Not about the strategy, about her." She looked at him. She almost said yes automatically. She almost picked up her pen and continued the strategy discussion. She almost did what she always did, which was fold the personal into the practical and keep moving. She stopped herself. "No," she said. "Not entirely." She set the pen down. "He's using me as the weak point. And the reason it works as a strategy is because my position here is—" She paused. It's not conventional. I know that. A woman who arrived on a mail-order bride train and stayed to manage a ranch that belongs to the man she stopped again. Adjusted. It looks exactly as easy to attack as he thinks it does. It's not weak, Nathan said. From the outside. From any side. His voice was firm. What you've built here in 5 weeks is not weak. And your being here is not irregular. It's the best thing that's happened to this ranch in 10 years. He paused. The best thing that's happened to me in longer than that. She looked at him. The kitchen was very quiet. That's not what we're supposed to be talking about right now, she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. I know, but I wanted to say it before the strategy conversation continued. He picked up the lawyer's letter. Now, tell me how we approach Briggs. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she picked up her pen. We go in the morning, she said. Early before he's settled into his office, and before Calloway has a chance to get there first. She started writing. And we bring the documentation of his family relationship to Calloway as a public record, because it is one. The marriage certificate is county property, and we don't threaten, we just lay it on the desk and let him understand what it means. And if he doesn't respond the way you expect, then we go to Judge Alderman and ask whether the board can compel disclosure of undeclared conflicts of interest in the loan manager appointment. She looked up. But Briggs will respond the way I expect. He's not a bad man. He's an ambitious man who made a convenient decision. Those are fixable. Nathan nodded slowly. You said we decide together, he said. Yes. I think you're right, he said. Morning. Early. Good. She returned to writing. He watched her for a moment. Margaret, he said. You said the best thing that's happened to the ranch. She kept writing. I heard the rest of it, she said quietly. He let that sit. Outside the evening was coming in over the valley, and the garden was deep green in the last of the light, and everything they had built together was still standing still, growing, still exactly where they'd planted it. And in the morning, they would go into Hargrove and finish this. Together. They left before sunrise. Margaret had the documentation folder ready by the door before Nathan came downstairs, and when he walked into the kitchen, she was already in her coat, her hair pinned back with the efficiency of someone who hadn't wasted time on anything that didn't matter. She handed him coffee in a travel cup, the kind she'd started making when she learned he never ate or drank enough before long drives, and picked up the folder and went to the wagon without a word. He stood in the kitchen for exactly 3 seconds, appreciating her before he followed. They rode to Hargrove in the dark and arrived as the town was beginning to wake the baker's light on the hotel chimney, smoking the general hum of a place remembering itself after the night. Briggs had taken the office above the bank, the same office Driscoll had occupied for 20 years, and when they arrived, the window light was already on. He's an early starter, Margaret said. Or he didn't sleep, Nathan said. Either way. She climbed down from the wagon. Let me take the lead. He looked at her. I know how to talk to men like Briggs, she said. Calloway is blunt force. Briggs is someone who made a calculation and is already wondering if it was the right one. You push Briggs directly and he digs in. You give him a way out and he takes it. And you know this because my father's banker in Ohio was exactly this kind of man. She straightened her coat. Ready. He gestured toward the door. Briggs opened it on the second knock, and the look on his face when he saw both of them standing there told Margaret everything she needed to know about where his head was that morning. Not hostile, not confident. The look of a man who had been awake for hours and was not entirely happy about the decisions that had kept him up. Miss Hayes, he said. Cole. He stepped back from the door. Come in. They sat across from his desk, Nathan straight-backed hat in hand, saying nothing. Margaret with the folder closed in front of her, completely composed. I imagine you're here about the Webb letter, Briggs said. I'm here about a professional conversation, Margaret said. Nothing more formal than that. Briggs looked at the folder. What's in there? He said. Your wife's maiden name is Calloway, Margaret said. That's in the county marriage record, which is public. Your appointment as loan manager came 3 weeks after Thomas Calloway requested a meeting with the bank's hiring committee, which is in the bank's own minutes also public. She paused. I'm not here to threaten you, Mr. Briggs. I want to say that clearly. I'm here because I think you're a man who made a convenient decision when the cost of that decision seemed low. And I want to give you the opportunity to understand that the cost has changed. Briggs was quiet. Webb's complaint, he said finally, wasn't my idea. I know that, Margaret said. It has Thomas's handwriting all over it, the timing, the leverage structure, the unnamed client. These are all Thomas Calloway patterns. She looked at him steadily. But if Webb files that complaint, your name gets associated with it. Not Thomas's. Yours. Because you're the loan manager, and the complaint is about documentation submitted to you, and the question of whether you voted against the coal note because of sound financial judgment, or because your brother-in-law told you to, is going to be the first thing Judge Alderman asks. Briggs's jaw tightened. Alderman doesn't have authority over loan decisions. No, Margaret said. But he has authority over board conduct reviews, and he has 30 years of institutional knowledge about how this bank is supposed to operate. She folded her hands on the table. Mr. Briggs, you've been in this office for less than 2 weeks. Your entire career in this valley depends on being seen as someone who makes decisions on merit. If this goes sideways, if it comes out that you voted against a sound recovery plan because of a family arrangement, and then facilitated a fraud complaint against the person who built that plan, that's not something you recover from. Not here. The silence in the office was very complete. Nathan said nothing. He watched Briggs and watched Margaret and felt the precision of what she was doing. Not hammering, not threatening. Just laying the landscape out with such clear-eyed accuracy that the man across the desk could see exactly where each road led. What do you want? Briggs said. Webb withdraws the complaint, Margaret said. Today, in writing, and you make no further challenges to the board's decision on the coal note for the duration of the existing term. She paused. In exchange, this conversation stays in this room. The marriage record stays in the county files where it belongs. And you get the chance to build a reputation in this valley on your own merits, which I suspect is what you actually want. Briggs looked at her. He looked at Nathan. He looked at the folder. You'd have to get Calloway to agree to pull the complaint, he said. I can't force Webb to withdraw. I know, Margaret said. You can tell Thomas that the alternative is a board conduct review initiated by Alderman, which I will request in writing this afternoon if the complaint isn't withdrawn. She paused. Thomas is a practical man. He'll understand the math. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Give me until noon. Margaret nodded. She picked up the folder and stood, and Nathan stood beside her, and she extended her hand across the desk, the way a business person extended a hand after a reasonable negotiation. Briggs looked at it for a moment. Then he shook it. Out on the boardwalk, Nathan let out a breath. Noon, he said. He'll have it done by 10, Margaret said. He wants this resolved before it gets bigger. How are you this certain about people you've known for 30 seconds? She glanced at him sideways. I told you, practice. They had coffee at the hotel restaurant to wait. Gerald Pierce saw them through the window and came out to say that the first produce delivery had been received and sold completely, and that he wanted to double the order for the following week. Margaret wrote the new quantities in her notebook while Pierce was still talking, and Pierce watched her with the expression of a man who understood he was dealing with someone considerably more organized than he'd expected. After Pierce went back inside, Nathan looked across the table at her. Double order, he said. I heard. That changes the fall projections. I know. I'm already recalculating. Of course you are. He picked up his coffee. Margaret. She looked up from the notebook. When this is done today, he said, I want to talk about something. Not strategy, not projections. He held her gaze. Something else. She looked at him. All right, she said carefully. He nodded. She looked back at the notebook and wrote approximately 4 words before she closed it and set it aside, and just sat there with her coffee, which for Margaret Hayes was the equivalent of anyone else pacing the length of a room. Briggs found them at the hotel restaurant at 20 minutes past 9. He sat down without being invited, which told Margaret he was unsettled, and placed a folded note on the table between them. Webb is withdrawing, he said quietly. Thomas agreed. No formal complaint, no challenge to the board decision. He paused. He wants it understood this is a final withdrawal, not a strategic pause. I want that in writing from Webb's office, Margaret said. It'll be there by end of day. Then we have an agreement. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Briggs, for what it's worth, I meant what I said. This is a good valley. There's real work to be done here, and people who need banking that's managed with integrity. She paused. You could be good at this job if you do it on your own. Briggs looked at her. Something moved across his face, not gratitude exactly, more like the expression of a man who had just been shown a door he hadn't seen before. I'll keep that in mind, he said. He left. Nathan looked at the folded note. He looked at Margaret. It's over, he said. Nearly, she said. End of day for the Webb withdrawal. Then it's over. He reached across the table and picked up her closed notebook and set it on the chair beside him and put his hand where it had been. She looked at her hand, now uncovered. She looked at him. Not yet, she said, but her voice was not entirely steady. We don't have the written confirmation yet, Margaret. We should go back to the ranch and wait and... Margaret. He didn't raise his voice. He just said it with the particular quiet wait that she had learned meant he was done waiting for something to become convenient. The note is controlled. Calloway is done. Briggs is going to do his job properly. The harvest comes in next month, and we'll make the March payment with room to spare. He looked at her steadily. What else needs to be settled before you'll let something happen? The restaurant was quiet around them. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't know how to do this, she said. Her voice was honest in the way it got when she ran out of room to be anything else. I know how to work. I know how to fix things. I know how to look at a problem and find the practical route through it. But this... She stopped. I've spent so long being the person who manages everything that I don't know what I look like when I'm not managing something. I do, he said. She looked at him. You laugh when something surprises you, he said. You talk yourself through decisions out loud without realizing you're doing it. You write in your notebook when you're trying not to feel something, and you close the notebook when you've given up not feeling it. He paused. You made coffee at midnight and left it on the stove without saying anything 3 times now because you knew I'd be up late and you didn't want to make it a conversation. He looked at her. That's what you look like when you're not managing something. You look like someone who cares very much and doesn't know what to do about it. The restaurant was completely quiet. Margaret's eyes were doing that thing they did, the brightness that she was very controlled about and very unsuccessfully controlled about. That's... She stopped, started again. You notice the coffee. I notice everything you do, he said simply. I have since the 3rd day. She pressed her lips together. Nathan, she said. Margaret, I'm in love with you, she said. She said it the way she said everything, directly, plainly, without decoration. As if the only way to deal with a true thing was to say it clearly and then stand behind it. I've known it since Iowa on the train coming here, when I realized I was hoping you'd be exactly who the letters made me think you were. And you were. You were exactly that person, and you're also more than that person, and I have spent 6 weeks being extremely practical about it, and I don't think I can do it anymore. The silence after that was the best silence Nathan Cole had ever sat inside. He stood up. He came around the table, and she looked up at him, and he took her face in both his hands, careful the way he did everything that mattered, and he kissed her. Right there in the Hargrove Grand Hotel restaurant with Gerald Pierce visible through the kitchen window, pretending not to watch with the September morning coming in through the glass and the whole valley going about its ordinary business outside. She kissed him back. She kissed him back the way she did everything she committed to, completely without reservation, with her whole self. And when they finally separated, she had her hands on his forearms, and her eyes were still closed for 1 more second. When she opened them, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not careful. Not reserved. Not the measured patience of a man managing expectations. Just open. Stay, he said. Not the careful version he'd offered before. Not through harvest or a few days or as long as you're useful. Just the word itself, clear and complete. Stay here. With me. Build this with me. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Outside, someone's horse went past on the street, and Pierce dropped something in the kitchen, and the ordinary morning continued in the ordinary way of mornings that had no idea they were happening inside something extraordinary. The web letter arrived at the ranch by 4 that afternoon. Margaret read it, verified the language, dated her copy, and filed it in the documentation folder with the same precision she applied to everything. Nathan watched her do this from across the kitchen table. Satisfied, he said. Nearly. She filed the folder. I want to write to Judge Alderman tomorrow. Just a brief note thanking him for his role. Men like that should know when they've been useful. And then, she looked at him. And then, she said, I think I'd like to plant the winter beds. If we want spring crop ready for Pierce's kitchen, the timing matters. He almost smiled. Come here, he said. The winter beds. We'll wait 20 minutes. He held out his hand. Come here. She looked at his hand. She closed the folder. She crossed the kitchen and took his hand and stood close and tipped her face up to look at him, and he looked back at her, and there were 1,000 things between them. 6 weeks of early mornings and long evenings and arguments about fence posts and grazing rotations, and a storm, and a lawyer's letter, and a bank board meeting, and 2 people who had been alone for long enough that they'd stopped believing it could be otherwise. I wrote you a letter, she said quietly, months ago under Eleanor's name, and I told you that needing someone wasn't weakness. I remember. I believed it when I wrote it, she said. I just didn't believe it about myself yet. He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his chest over his heart, where Eleanor's last letter had rested for 3 weeks on a train platform that now felt like another life. Do you believe it now? He said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I do. He kissed her again, quiet and unhurried in the kitchen of the ranch that was no longer failing in the house that was no longer empty. And she held on with both hands, the way Eleanor had told her to, staying long enough to see finally seeing. The harvest came in on a Tuesday in the first week of October, better than the projections, which meant better than Marsh had estimated, which meant considerably better than anyone had dared to plan for in August, when the whole future of the ranch had been a question mark balanced on the edge of a bank board vote. Nathan and Margaret worked the harvest side by side, and 2 of the neighboring families came to help in the way of valley communities that have decided someone is worth helping. And Clara Dent came out from town with 2 of the women from the dry goods supply and worked as hard as anyone, and by the end of the first day, the barn was fuller than it had been since Nathan's father's best year. That evening, standing in the barn doorway, with the smell of cut hay and the sounds of a harvest supper being assembled in the house behind him, Nathan looked out over the land his father had left him and felt something he could not immediately name. It took him a moment. It was peace, not the absence of problems. There would always be problems. That was ranching, that was land, that was life. But something underneath the problems that held steady. A foundation. The feeling of a thing built correctly with the right materials by hands that knew what they were doing. He heard Margaret's voice in the kitchen, organizing the supper arrangement, with the cheerful efficiency she'd found somewhere in the last month. Less managed, more natural, as if she'd stopped holding something back, and the thing underneath was lighter and warmer than the careful composure had suggested. He heard Clara Dent laugh at something she said, and 2 other voices join in. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment, and just listened. Then, Clara Dent appeared in the house doorway and called, "Cole, if you don't come in now, Margaret's going to eat your share on principle," and he went in. The kitchen was full. 7 people around a table built for 4, and nobody minded the crowding, and the food was Margaret's cooking, which had become over 6 weeks, the standard by which the valley now measured what a meal was supposed to taste like. She was at the far end of the table talking to one of the neighboring wives about the winter crop rotation with her notebook beside her plate. Because of course it was, and she glanced up when Nathan came in, and something in her face did the particular thing it did now, when she looked at him, the warmth that she no longer tried to moderate. He found the one open seat, which was beside her, and sat down. "You were standing in the barn," she said without looking up from the conversation. "I was. I could see you from the kitchen window." "I know." "What were you doing?" "Thinking," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "About you," he said simply. Clara Dent on Margaret's other side made a sound that was half a laugh and pretended it was a cough, and Margaret's face did something that was entirely unguarded and warm, and she picked up her fork and returned to the conversation about winter crops with the serenity of a woman who had decided she was allowed to be happy and was going to be extremely competent about it. 3 weeks later, Thomas Calloway sold his interest in the eastern grazing acreage to a family from Wyoming and relocated his primary operations to a different county. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain it. He was simply less present and then not present the way bad weather moved on when conditions no longer supported it. Nathan heard about it from Hewitt at the feed store. He came home and told Margaret. She looked up from the winter bed calculations. "Good," she said. "That's all. What else is there to say?" She went back to the calculations. "The east grazing acreage coming available is interesting, actually, if the new owners want a water rights agreement. Margaret, we could potentially expand the cattle rotation into the eastern section and reduce our winter hay cost significantly, which would—" "Margaret." He sat down across from her. "Calloway is gone." She set down her pen. She looked at the table. Then she looked at him, and she smiled, the real one, the unguarded one, the one that still surprised him every time because of how much was in it. "Good," she said again, and meant it differently this time. In November, the March payment to the bank was made 4 months early. Margaret went with Nathan to Driscoll's retirement party. The old manager had invited them both specifically and shook Nathan's hand with the warmth of a man watching something turn out better than he'd dared to hope. And across the room, Harlan Briggs saw them and raised his glass once briefly, in the manner of a man who had chosen the better road and knew who had shown it to him. Margaret saw it and didn't comment. But she touched Nathan's arm as they turned away, and he covered her hand with his, and Driscoll noticed and looked pleased. The night before December arrived, they sat on the porch in the cold with coffee, which was something they'd started doing in October when the evenings turned and the stars got their winter clarity. Margaret had her coat pulled close and her notebook on her knee, but she wasn't writing in it. She was looking at the stars. "I wrote the letter," she said. Nathan knew which one. She'd been talking about it for 2 months. "To Eleanor," he said. "Yes." She looked at the sky. "I told her she was right, that the ranch was fixable and the water problem was solvable, and that you were exactly who the letters made me think you were." She paused. "I told her I was sorry I didn't get to say goodbye properly, and I told her—" She stopped. "What?" "I told her I was happy." She said it quietly, like something being admitted for the first time, like a word she'd been carrying in both hands and had finally set down somewhere permanent. "I don't think I'd said that out loud to anyone before. It felt—" She paused. "It felt like the truest thing I'd written in a long time." Nathan looked at her profile in the dark. The line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself, which had changed somewhere in the last 4 months from careful containment to something easier, something that had room in it. "Are you?" he said. She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said. "I am." He reached into his coat pocket. She watched him do it. He placed a ring on the railing between them. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just set it there and left his hand beside it and looked at her. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Nathan," she said. "I bought it the week after the harvest," he said. "I've been trying to find the right moment for 6 weeks, and I've decided there's no right moment, and the waiting is making me considerably more anxious than I'd like to be." She looked at the ring again. It was simple. A plain silver band with a single small stone, practical and clean. The kind of ring a man bought when he understood the woman he was buying it for. "I know how this started," he said. "I know the whole shape of it. Eleanor, the letters, the broker, all of it. And I'm not asking you to forget any of that or pretend it was simple. I'm asking you because I know exactly who you are." He paused. "I know you wake up before I do every single day and make coffee you don't always drink. I know you reorganized the supply pantry 3 times, and each time you told yourself it was the last time. I know you talk to Eleanor when you think no one can hear." His voice was quiet and steady. "I know you crossed half this country to keep a promise you didn't have to keep, and stayed to fix things you didn't have to fix, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, You fixed something in me I didn't know was broken." He looked at her. "I love you, Margaret Hayes. Stay." She was holding the porch railing with both hands. Her eyes were very bright. "You've been carrying that ring for 6 weeks," she said. "Yes." "In your coat pocket?" "Yes." "That's not good for a ring, Nathan, the lining of a coat." "Margaret." She stopped. She picked up the ring from the railing. She turned it once in her fingers. She looked at him with the full weight of everything. She was the woman who had managed a dying farm and buried 2 people she loved and crossed a continent alone and rebuilt a failing ranch from the soil up and learned harder than almost anything else she'd ever learned that needing someone was not the same as being weak. "Yes," she said. She put the ring on her own finger, which was so entirely Margaret that he laughed the surprised, genuine kind, and she looked at him with a warmth that had no managed edges left in it. "I would have put it on," he said. "I know." She held out her hand and looked at the ring. "But I wanted to do it myself." He took her hand and held it. They sat on the porch in the November cold, with the stars very clear overhead, and the ranch quiet around them, and the coffee went cold in their cups, and neither of them moved for a long time. The woman who had arrived with a suitcase and a dead woman's letter, and no intention of staying, had stopped leaving the moment she picked up a shovel and fixed a fence she had no obligation to fix. She had stayed through the garden and the water system, and the bank board meeting, and the lawyer's letter, and the harvest, and the November night. And she was going to keep staying, because this was what belonging felt like. Not a place you were born into, but a place you built with your hands, and chose with your whole self, and decided every morning was worth the work. Nathan Cole had stood on a train platform, waiting for a future that was never going to arrive. What arrived instead was better than anything he'd planned, for which was the thing about futures: you could organize for them, and project them, and calculate them in notebooks until midnight. But the real ones, the ones that lasted, were the ones that showed up unannounced and changed everything you thought you were waiting for. He had not found love in a letter. He had found it standing in the dirt of his south field, explaining water pipe grades and grazing rotations to a man who had given up on his own land. He had found it in a woman who fixed things not because she was asked to, but because it was in her nature to see what was broken and make it whole. And she had found what Eleanor promised she would find if she only stayed long enough to see it. Not a rescue, not a transaction, not an obligation fulfilled. A partnership, a home. A man who noticed the midnight coffee and said nothing about it because some things were better understood than explained. The wrong arrival had been from the very first step off that train exactly right, and the life they were going to build from here together, with clear eyes and full hands, and all the stubbornness that 2 practical people could bring to the work of loving each other well, was going to be more than either of them had thought to ask for. It was going to be enough. It was going to be everything.